Comprehensive nonsense.
Comprehensive nonsense.
Comprehensive nonsense.
Comprehensive nonsense.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to Comprehensive Nonsense. And we're doing a continuation, really, of the past couple of episodes, which started talking about science and evolved into many different topics related to that. And the end of the last episode really forayed into the realm of consciousness, free will, morality, objective reality, and ended up with happiness and utilitarianism. So we thought this podcast we could continue that with thinking about morality as a larger topic. So we'll start by just going over the idea of utilitarianism, which, before I do that, I'm going to introduce our guests for tonight. So first off, we have Aamir, who is a friend of mine from school.
Hello.
He's at Oxford University at the minute, and he's studying a master's in the study of religion with specialism in Hinduism and Buddhism, having studied an undergraduate degree in theology. We're also joined tonight by Max and Mikey, who are on last week's episode, and they will be, so we've got them as well. And so, starting off with utilitarianism. Now, as a moral philosophy, utilitarianism is the idea to maximize the good, and it's a type of what I understand to be consequentialism, which is the idea that human morals are a constructed thing by humans. And they're there to kind of serve purpose in society. And this is as opposed to the idea of deontology, which is that the moral rules or morals come from rules, and those rules are kind of out there to be found. Deontology relates to often these morals come from like a god, so they're rules that you kind of have to come up against. And both of these, I mean, these aren't the only two sort of moral ideas, but both of these, there will be obvious cases where they don't match up. Thinking about utilitarianism, there's the idea of the repugnant conclusion, which is when you're talking about utilitarianism, you have to think about, you have to measure in some way what is good, what is moral. And you're trying to maximize this measured thing, but what is this measured thing? You still got to have a hierarchy of value, and this breaks down as moral intuitions don't often fit easily with the idea of a number of utility. For example, one version of utilitarianism would be where if you're trying to maximize, say, happiness of humans, well, if you've got a much larger amount of humans who have a much lower standard of happiness in each human, that's surely better than a small amount of humans with a high level of happiness. But also, coming back to sort of, we're talking about meta ethics in all of this. It's like, why are we justifying these morals, these rules in the first place? And all these moral philosophies are ways of trying to guide your intuitions in case those intuitions are wrong. That's what sort of morals have been created for. Yet, the idea of moral intuition, like these philosophies themselves, they come from a place of moral intuition. We don't just pick them randomly. They do originate from somewhere. So, are these morals a sort of inherent quality of the world, of the universe? Are they just made up by us? Who knows?
I'm intrigued by two things there.
Go on.
The first is the deontology one, with like having like a set of rules that you then fine. Like, then they kind of moral guidance, like kind of one's given by God, for example, as you said. But like, I'm just intrigued as to like what the driver is to follow those rules.
The driver is
like,
the idea.
Why follow them?
The idea that these rules are kind of set in place, and if you follow those rules, you will be a good person. These rules are set in place by something larger than yourself, like a god, or they're kind of inherent, maybe. I mean, maybe a better way.
And it being good, I mean, to be fair, this might be valid enough, but you being a good person is sort of the driver. People arbitrarily want to be good. I suppose it's not arbitrary because it is good, isn't it? Yeah, no, valid. And then the next thing was just the utilitarian question about lots of people who are less happy and small number of people who are more happy. And I could see Mikey pulling the same face that I did at the time. I was sort of thinking, I mean, provided that these people are all actually happy, because the way that sounded to me was like there's a lot of people who are unhappy. And if a lot of people were unhappy, that would be a lot of negative rather than kind of a large amount of small positives. But I mean, if there were a large amount of small positives versus, I mean, having said last week, I think it's fairly obvious that I am, broadly speaking, with a few tweaks and kind of ifs and buts, utilitarian. And I was just thinking, yeah, would I subscribe to that? And if there were like a lot more people who were like, I don't know, 80% of the way, like, I don't know, 40% of the way to euphoria, and then a smaller, precisely less than 2.5 times smaller people who are 100% of the way to euphoria, then yeah, I'd probably buy that being a positive. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify that you meant a kind of little happiness rather than.
I think your brother made a good point today, Emma, about because he more viewed it as there being an importance on the average level of happiness. Because as I view it, utilitarians say that it's the total happiness that matters. And as you say, if there's a large portion of people who are less happy than the average person in a smaller population, but the total happiness is larger, that is better. And
that still comes against, I think, the main problem with utilitarianism is that you've got to choose something to measure. And by measuring something, you're kind of abstracting something. And like, where does this choice of what to measure come from?
I think from a psychological perspective, that is sort of the main thing. Is like when you try and define happiness, you realize it's such an elusive concept and even harder to measure that it doesn't make sense as a thing. You certainly can't sort of do it numerically and sort of balance it. And really that's why sort of a lot of, well, it goes back to Bentham, a lot of Bentham's ideas about measuring utility, they sort of went by the wayside in the 20th century. And people sort of said, we can't measure utility. It might exist, but it's not a very useful concept. Because like, what is happiness? What is, how do you measure that concept? And it also, this is sort of like the fundamentals of economics, that people talk about preference utility rather than sort of absolute utility, just because happiness is such a hard concept to measure.
Yeah. I mean, I would add that some of the happiest people I know personally are actively not utilitarian, and that they find a lot of their own happiness in an idea of ethics that isn't consequentialist, in that it comes from some sort of like moral principles that they really value, or it comes like in a more sort of virtue ethical way, like kind of character, or these broader values that they've constructed, but they're not consequentialist. And it's interesting. I think perhaps a good argument against utilitarianism is that a load of utilitarians are probably not the happiest people. And so, and I think that it's interesting because my argument against utilitarianism is that utilitarianism fundamentally misunderstands the human mind and happiness, perhaps related to that psychology point.
Well, you just met me, so you can cross off one unhappy utilitarian.
True. No, I'm always like, yeah, maybe that's too ad hominem of an argument, but
no.
I do think utilitarianism misunderstands human happiness.
When you talk about some of the happiest people, what kind of morality do they believe in? You're talking about sort of religious in some sense, or?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I think like a devotion to like a sense of being human that goes beyond themselves. And so that includes a kind of devotion to kind of moral principles and practices that they might not be able to understand fully. They might not be able to sort of justify based on a principle like utilitarianism, but it's that kind of like willingness to accept or willingness to go along with something that they can't fully understand that makes them very happy. And I think perhaps that like my fundamental criticism with utilitarianism is that it tries to oversimplify this thing called human happiness or human flourishing or whatever into kind of a measurable, like analytic category that we could call the principle of utility, which is maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number. And it's something that's very easy to work with, but in reality sort of misses this whole really complicated thing. Yeah.
So what I would argue against that is that, so I don't see utilitarianism as a way to make yourself happy. It's more of you know, like it's how you should act to kind of, you know, increase the global happiness. So it would be a very valid application of utilitarianism if it happened to be that the best thing you could do to increase happiness is no one believes in utilitarianism and everyone believes in you know, some other belief. If that just, you know, in some way the human mind works, if that makes people happier, you know, that could be true.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I would sort of agree, but wouldn't that undermine utilitarianism if ultimately holding it as a belief doesn't accomplish the goals that it hopes to?
I guess it's sort of the thing that the way you see the world isn't, you know, it's connected to your own happiness. So if you choose to be a utilitarian, that's not just like, that's not just how you act, that also actually affects your own happiness. So you can't kind of disconnect your perspective of the world from your own happiness. So it's like yeah, like, because I have found, like you're saying about utilitarian people, you know, not being happy. Like I have found, you know, trying to be really utilitarian sometimes is like, it's not that fun, because you feel, you know, like, oh, I'm spending this money on something for myself, and it's like, oh, well, that's being selfish, you know, I should be giving it to charity or something like that. And you kind of,
that's where you've got to splash in a bit of egoism.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you justify all the doubts we filled in kind of last week. I don't know you're all real, so you're not quite worth the same as me.
Exactly.
No, the other thing is, I never really, I mean, obviously in its origin it was about sort of measuring happiness, but I think it's fairly obvious, and has been said by you guys already, that happiness is a kind of elusive kind of concept. It's just basically any feeling that is good, and is almost impossible to measure. I say almost because I guess there's like a shred of hope that at some point in the long distant future we'll understand brains enough to be able to do so, if it's even found there. But I guess that then leaves, you know, I leave the proof to the reader, as it were, and everyone have to kind of make their own judgment call on what happiness is, kind of your own kind of mental kind of measurement of how you would say what makes people happy. And obviously you can ask them as well. That's probably a better way of doing it than just kind of saying, well, that's going to make this person happy. But you know, I think making I think the whole point of kind of modern utilitarian, or maybe not the whole point, but a large kind of portion of thought there now is, you know, you subscribe to these principles, and you do what you think makes other people most happy, because obviously you can't precisely measure it.
One of my lecturers actually, he's big into happiness, and he has a pretty good definition, which sort of, I mean, it sort of works. It's like there's problems with it, as there's problems with anything in happiness, but he defines it. He's called Paul Dolan. He defines it as happiness is maximizing your pleasure and your purpose, but he leaves it up to the person, like how much you want to maximize of each. So pleasure, obviously, like good feelings, spending time with friends, I don't know, getting drunk, sort of eating nice food, but also purpose, like doing well in exams, having sort of something that motivates you. So I think something like that.
Purpose, getting drunk, having nice food.
Yeah, if your purpose is that as well, then that's fine. But yeah, but he leaves it up to, like, there's so much that it has to be left up to the individual in terms of happiness, but that sort of captures like the sort of things you need to do.
I mean, it seems to me to be like, whether you define it as happiness or you define happiness as pleasure and purpose, I think that then the question just becomes about what is purpose, right? So you've always got this question of this thing that you have to define. And if you you acknowledge, I think, as we've just done in the conversation, that it's really complicated, and that happiness or that purpose kind of encapsulates both the person getting drunk at the pub and also the monk who's renounced like his or her whole life and has given everything to their religion. If your definition of happiness or purpose has to encompass both of those, because it has to encompass each person's own individuality, then it becomes so arbitrary and vague that, like, how do you even act on that? You know?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a descriptive sort of way of describing happiness rather than prescriptive. And obviously that's the core problem, is that there's so much, like, how do you live the good life? How do you actually make sure that happiness is there for everyone? That's a bit of an open question.
It becomes somewhat circular, right? Like, if the utilitarian position is that what's most ethical is to or maybe not the utilitarian position, but if you say something like every person is seeking happiness, and then happiness is this really vague concept that encompasses all of these different things, and then you try and define happiness, and then you end up basically saying that happiness is what people are seeking. So it becomes circular, right? Everyone's seeking happiness. What is happiness? It's what we're seeking. And so then you've not really said anything when you said that, well, we all need to seek happiness and maximize this happiness, and that we all need to do act in order to maximize happiness, because, well, we're all doing that anyway, because it's just what we seek. It's the same thing.
But I mean,
well, that's what economists did. That's they said, well, happiness is what people prefer to do, and people do what they prefer. There you go. That's circular, and that's a bit of a problem.
But people do things that make them unhappy, though.
They also do, yeah.
I guess, but some people might define that as, actually, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, are you guys saying that utilitarianism is a personal objective, or is it a collective objective? Is it coming from an individual or as a group movement?
I think it can be both, right?
And if it's personal, then what's the difference between utilitarianism and just hedonism?
Well, because it would be a personal objective to help others, right?
But does that not also come under the bracket of hedonism?
Well,
I think hedonism could be a form of utilitarianism. I think you could be a utilitarian hedonist, because I think hedonism is just saying that the one thing that's valuable is pleasure, and it's not necessarily egoism. So I think in a way the early, like, Bentham was probably a hedonist, right? Because he thought that pleasure was the ultimate value.
Yeah, because he rejected the idea that there were like higher forms of happiness, and just said there was only kind of all happiness was equal, and eating a chocolate bar was as valuable as, you know, studying important things that need studying, or doing important things that need doing, if it gave you the same amount of joy.
How do you measure? Sorry, it's just my brain trying to figure this out. But how are you all measuring what you? I mean, how measuring what you find like pleasurable? Like the chocolate bar could be as pleasurable to someone else and collectively better for the greater good than another thing. Like, is there something that you're basing it off, like a set of criteria, just to pedal back?
No, I just go on a hunch.
I think you can have a kind of rough criteria. I mean, so the thing that makes me think that this does exist as well, there is some vaguely numeric value of happiness, is like my criteria would be, I mean, okay, you can consider, you know, doing two different actions and just think, okay, if I'd have done action A versus action B, which one would I have rather done? You know, would I have rather eaten a chocolate bar or like stabbed a knife into my hand? And you can go, okay, I'd have rather eaten a chocolate bar. So therefore, you know, you have this action is better than this action, and then you do that with every single pair of actions, and you have a ranking.
That was an exceptionally Chomsky way of doing things.
Yeah, well, that's expected utility theory in economics. What you've done there. So
the other thing I just want to say before this kind of the break that's going to occur in about 3 minutes 45 seconds. But the other thing I just wanted to say was, like, if you believe the world has no intrinsic meaning, then any definition or any kind of moral concept you come up with surely has to be circular.
Also,
well, just because it's always going to come back to coming from you, your own purpose, because you're believing that the rest of the world has no intrinsic meaning.
so you think it will always come down to sort of an individual choice of what they believe or what they choose to be most moral? Is that?
Yeah, I think so. If you believe that there's kind of no inherent outer purpose to the rest of the world, then you're having to give that a purpose, give that meaning, which I think is one way you could interpret or arrive at the conclusion of utilitarianism, right? It's probably the way I think.
When you say the outer world, do you mean like the physical world? So could you believe that the physical world has no intrinsic value, but you believe that consciousness has some sort of intrinsic value?
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, if you believe that consciousness is part of the physical world.
Sure. So yeah, then I think I would say that if you believe that in that sense, if you're like a physical reductionist, so you believe that the whole world is just the physical process is understood by science, and you don't think that anything in that world has any intrinsic value, then I think you're not a moralist, because I think morality in itself needs, like, as a concept, implies normativity. So it implies that moral truths make a claim on us and that we have to follow them. And if you don't believe that there's any way to ground that normativity, then I just don't think perhaps you could. So
then you say you're amoral, but then you still have a concept of like good and bad, though, right?
Yeah, I guess you're morally sort of relative. It's a relativism, isn't it, rather than sort of amoral.
Being a moralist or not.
Like grounding morality, what like in the world has to exist for us to be moral.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one.
Which I'm not necessarily sure I'm not necessarily sure I agree with.
Yeah.
But I think that probably comes from me being an evolutionary biologist. Like, I studied something that basically revolves around complex systems arising from non-complex parts, and those kind of slowly getting more, kind of having more intrinsic features. And I think one of those features for me that cropped up as evolution went on was kind of, want a better word, motivation, which provided a good and a bad. And then that good and a bad is now the basis of morality. So it's kind of like a byproduct of a world. It's like something that was formed from a world that never had good or bad, as it were.
Yeah. But perhaps, yeah, I mean, like maybe we could just reduce morality to the motivations instilled in us by the processes of evolution, right? So that if evolution, and I think people do this. And
yeah, the only thing I just want to say before we train off on that thought is the motivations. I often have issues with people interpreting and, as I would say, misinterpreting theories of evolution. And I think the world's had a lot of that as well. But yeah, just because we have these motivations instilled in us doesn't mean that they are sort of self-fulfilling. But
self-fulfilling?
Like, I'm trying to think of a better way to phrase this. Say what you were going to say, and I will have sort of, yeah, I might have come up with what I mean in a sort of succinct manner.
Yeah. I don't know. I haven't really thought about this for a while, but yeah. I think perhaps the question of whether we can ground morality is more of a question of, well, I don't know. There's lots of things going through my head. I think it's definitely true that we've evolved in a certain way, and that process of evolution has created the beings we are. Right? I think that we can't really deny that unless we kind of get into the territory of like particular versions of Christianity or something. But I think we can all accept that that has been the case. And if it's created the beings we are, it's created our motivations and the kind of drives and psychological forces that push us to do certain things. But then the question becomes a question of whether our morality, the morality that we talk about, the morality that we're arguing over, the morality that we're trying to ground, you know, like perhaps in today's world, it's kind of a sense of rights and things like that. The question is whether that's properly groundable. And just because we've evolved in a certain way and we've had certain motivations instilled in us, the question of grounding that seems to me to be more of a question of like physicalism versus non-physicalism, of like what kind of statements we would class as real or as meaningful or as true. And that's a question of, you know, what things are there in the world. And so the question of physicalism then becomes like the question of whether you can reduce everything simply to the mechanical processes of like physics. So for me, I think the question of evolution when it comes to morality perhaps is less relevant.
Could you,
I rambled a lot.
No, that was great. Can you just explain what physicalism and non-physicalism are?
Yeah, in my understanding, physicalism is just the idea that everything in the world is physical. So anything that really exists is physical, and the physical, you know, that trying to like define that is a particularly hard question. But I think it's generally understood to be the things that that can be explained or can be described accurately by like modern physics.
Only the stuff that can be described by modern physics. So any of the stuff that we haven't yet been able to describe wouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's an interesting question. But modern physics, at least perhaps, even if there are physical things that we haven't like described yet, the only way that we could describe them would be through physics, perhaps. Maybe that's what a physical is.
Through a kind of the method of, physics. The only thing I would say is I struggle to see how, if you can't measure something, at least in theory, in practice is a different question, but if you can't, at least in theory, measure something, I struggle to see how it could have meaning. Yeah, that's why I mean, it's obviously impossible for us at the moment in practice to measure, you know, happiness, but one can think of, as Mikey said, things that are probably happier or intrinsically better than other things. Emma made a good comment in a previous podcast about Sam Harris saying, you know, you could have like a worst possible world, then you can have something better. Obviously, you can't measure the exact reasons why something would be better than a worst possible world, but you do potentially have a kind of, you can think of perhaps nebulous concepts that might enable you to measure those, right? And I think if something doesn't have a kind of, at least a theoretical, like, mental way of measuring it, at least through relativism, then I don't really see how it could have meaning, because you don't have a kind of like a positive or negative pole.
I mean, I think we're often always motivated by things that we can't measure, though, right? Like,
yeah,
I might be like,
well,
I could
things that we can't measure yet, or things that we can't ever measure.
Maybe not that we could ever measure, but I don't think it's true to say that only things that we could measure are like, things have to be measurable to be meaningful, because I think a lot of things that we find very meaningful, the word meaningful is somewhat nebulous as well, right? But a lot of the things that we're motivated to do, so it's like putting this in the realm of like moral action, a lot of the things that we're motivated to seek are things that we have no definition for, right? So we're always sort of going around trying to be happier people. But if you then, like, I guess the conversation shows that if we try and define what that happiness is, we get into a lot of trouble. So I don't think it's true that human beings have to be motivated by something that is definable or meaningful. We often just act without knowing why or like where we're going, but we move anyway.
Yeah, this is an idea that I've been thinking about a lot, actually, is how, I guess it kind of relates to the idea of like moral intuition, or just intuition as a whole, that the reason why we do things is often just, we just do them, we just kind of act them, or it feels right, or we're just kind of drawn to that, and we may often like add on a lot of rationale.
Is that not just a form of happiness though, right? If you're motivated to do it, there's something in your brain that's telling you you're going to feel happier if you do it. So intuition is fulfilling. That's just the way I would sort of see it from an evolutionary perspective.
Perhaps we can say that we'd be happier. It's not that we're like going to seek a particular goal, so that happiness is constituted by something that's definable. But when we say, I guess when we say that we'd do it because we'd be happier, all I guess maybe we're saying is that like doing the things that we want will make us happier. So happiness is just getting what we want, but then that becomes circular again in the way that I guess we were talking about.
But also, is it being circular necessarily a problem?
It's maybe not a problem definitionally, but it's a problem when it comes to understanding it and getting it to be like something meaningful that we can use to determine what how best to act, right?
Only if you're saying that meaning is like objective rather than individual. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding here somewhere, but as I understand it, like utilitarianism is a fairly circular concept, in that I want to maximize happiness because happiness is good, and happiness is defined as any intrinsically good feeling. So good is happiness. So like that definition is inherently circular. That does, for some reason, doesn't seem to trigger any alarm bells in my head, and I'm still willing to maximize it.
But we still got questions of what happiness and good is. You can't.
Well, good is any happy feeling, and happiness is any feeling that makes you feel good.
Yeah, but you probably need a definition of both if you want a complete sort of way of doing things, don't you?
But well, yeah, but as in, you can only define that the feeling of happiness and good is very, like, that's subjective to you. You know what you feel as happiness, so you can't really define it in the English language any more concisely than that.
Yeah, but
just define it through comparison, no? And what I'm thinking right now is, when you define happiness, are you comparing it with something that you've already done for you, or are you comparing it to someone else?
Oh, you can only truly like understand or know your own happiness. You might all look happy when you smile and stuff, but I can't actually know that I'm not feeling that same happy. I can't know you're happy for certain. So I think you can only really compare it to yourself and then assume that others feel it.
I think Zoe makes a good point though, in that a lot of what makes us happy is defined to a reference point, and how you define that reference point sort of makes you happy or unhappy. So like, let's say I define my reference point as if I'm not a billionaire by the age of 25, then I failed in life. It's obviously not going to happen. Probably not going to happen.
Never know.
So I think there's something there that what you define as your reference point is going to impact how happy or unhappy you are.
Well, I think this leads into something. Yeah, so we went on a walk with my brother earlier today in the snow, which was lovely, and we talked about a lot of things. So
Is he coming on the pod?
Huh?
Is he a big fan? When's he coming on the pod?
He was like, "Oh, I'm double booked tonight. Sorry."
Yeah, James.
Oh, too highbrow a guest.
Yeah, he just hasn't got time for us. But yeah, so in an example of like defining happiness to a reference point, we were kind of talking about how, or maybe I was talking about how, is it then not possible for that person to be happy like in another way or through another means? Like, can those same kind of needs be fulfilled in another way? So this is kind of thinking about how you can, we would actually, in this example, we were talking about people who run prisons in America and saying how, okay, these people who run prisons, the prisons are private, which incentivizes them to keep people in prisons, which is obviously not great, or we think it's obviously not great, but that person who's running the prison is probably like, yeah, I'm doing good, I've got a family, I'm providing for them, I'm keeping the evil people away from the rest of the world. And it's like, well, so who's right in that scenario if we think the world could be happier if he didn't do that, and he thinks the world's happy and if he did that? But then is it a question of, could one of us be happier given a different situation, or like with different ways of kind of fulfilling our needs, or kind of, is there even needs that are universal across humans? Also the idea that everyone, if you are fully put in someone else's shoes, you would do exactly the same as them, or would you? It opens up a lot of doors in terms of what happiness means, what it could be, and what that means when you're trying to think about making the world a better place, in terms of, because an argument that I often hear is that it's like, well, if that makes that other person happy, then surely that's okay. And they're thinking like, but I mean, I wouldn't be happy doing that. That person may be harming other people, but if it makes them happy, is that okay? But could they be happier in a different way? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time, and in this conversation as well, we sort of assume that every person's happiness is definable only by them. But perhaps I think that's a very modern assumption, because we all sort of see ourselves as like isolated individuals.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's quite a Western assumption as well, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. Whereas, like, I don't think that's very psychologically real. I think often people will say they're doing things that's making them happy, or they're making this choice, but really it doesn't end up making themselves happy. And yeah, like throughout history, people just wouldn't have seen it that way. They would have said, well, there's certain things that you do to be happy. Happiness, isn't such a personal choice.
Aamir, I'm just wondering, you said you study Hinduism and Buddhism, right? How is it that those religions talk about individuality? Like, does it exist within them, or is it very collective in the language?
Yeah, so when you say individuality, do you mean this thing of each person has their own kind of happiness that's defined on their own terms?
Yeah, like, does that exist, or is it always defined against the group? Or
it's interesting. I don't think. Well, so in Hinduism, there's this kind of sense of a group through the concept of Dharma, right? So Dharma is a word that's really hard to translate, but like duty, I think, is perhaps a good starting point. Duty or law or the good. And in Hinduism, historically, it's a somewhat contentious subject, but they've had like a defined sense of Dharma. So you have being born into Hindu society means that you're born into a certain caste, and within that caste, you're born into a certain what's called a jati, or like a group, and then you're born into a certain gender. And so all of those things define who you are and what you do. So there is a kind of level of individuality in that each person has a kind of different place in society, but it's that place in society that makes you who. Perhaps like a concrete way of putting it is that if you guys ask me today, like who I am, you ask me who I thought I was, like what was most meaningful to me, I might give you some answers based on things that I've conceived of myself to have chosen. Whereas I think in Hindu society, in ancient Hindu society, I guess, which is what I've been studying, that question might be answered based on their caste and their jati and their gender and their stage in life. So it was much more communal in that sense, less individual. But then interestingly, if I can keep talking, that was like Hindu society, right? That was like the kind of mainstream Hindu society. And I also want to caveat by saying that that's like a very particular image that's like given by some texts, and historians debate whether that was an actual reflection of Hindu society or whether that's what the priestly caste wanted people, or like that's the ideal that the priestly caste had for Hindu society. But you also have the whole thing in ancient India of renouncers, or people who leave the home and go on their own kind of individual quest. And that's kind of where things kind of get a bit more interesting, I guess, because it seems a lot more individualistic in that they're not worried about their role in society. They're kind of there to sort of figure out their own happiness. But it's not individualistic in the sense that I was talking about, in the sense of like the modern West, where the individual is defined by these kind of unique characteristics that kind of constitute their personality, right? Like I'm a happy person, I'm an anxious person, I like the guitar, I like mountains instead of beaches, right? These are the things that we kind of think of ourselves, and we kind of assume that everyone has them. They kind of just appear as part of your personality.
But are they not, just to jump in, are they not inherently like defining yourself as liking a guitar, or, you know, being part of this group or that group? Are they not intrinsically kind of non-individualist? Because you're defining yourself as liking something that isn't unique to you. Like many people, you're part of, you know, X group and Y group, and that I like guitars and I like going hiking, and, you know, I have this skin color and this religion. It's like I'm part of this group and that group and this group and that group.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's very much true. I think it's often a criticism leveled against people, right? Like you say that, oh, you're trying to be an individual, but you're just going along with this group. I think perhaps we sort of see it as a choice. I think we kind of locate individuality in this kind of place of choice. So people like feel like individuals when they've made like unique choices, I suppose. But like, yeah, and I think in the Indian case, just to sort of finish that point, they were kind of individual searching for their own things, but they weren't searching to kind of maximize what they could choose, right? They weren't sort of trying to go off and choose like a particular form of life based on their own choice, but they were trying to find the truth, I would say, and they were trying to find the end of suffering. And so although they were like individuals, they were like going for a like universal quest in that, like trying to find out what's really going on, and that doesn't depend on who I am and my choices. That's the case. And I want to end my suffering, which is, you know, the universal, I think even is accepted today, that all conscious beings suffer, and that's a really important part of being conscious. So, yeah, if that answers the question.
Do you think even enlightened Buddhists, for example, suffer? Or have they separated, or been able to separate themselves out from suffering?
Well, I mean, enlightenment is meant to be the end of suffering. Right?
Yeah.
That's the whole shtick.
But what is suffering?
It's the opposite of happiness, isn't it? You get the same problems, but just in the
there we
mirror.
go. We've defined it.
Yeah. And then when you say all beings suffer, is it like a default state, or is it like something I've probably like? Is it something you've gone through? Or is it like when you say all people suffer? Is that if you're a baby and you're alive for sort of 3 seconds and then you kind of, for whatever reason, stop living, and and all you felt was like a brief moment of euphoria. Did you suffer? Like what is it, like a state that we're all likely to go into, or is it a state, like a default state that we're all in, and then we occasionally leave it and be happy for a while?
I think the Buddhists, it's an interesting question. I think the Buddhists would probably say that it's a default state we're all in. I think it would be sort of understood on both terms that you were suggesting.
I guess, like, if you can feel, then you can suffer. So if you have the propensity to have feelings, then you have the propensity to feel sort of negative feelings. So I guess for anyone that's conscious, I guess you can suffer. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to, but I guess from
that's what I'm because it sounded like Aamir was saying that we do suffer rather than we can.
Well,
yeah, I mean, go ahead, Emma.
Well, surely we all know some kind of suffering in our life.
Yeah, but that's because we've lived long enough to experience it.
No. I don't. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Aamir, but I don't think it's suffering is just in terms of like the really bad stuff that happens. It's more kind of anything bad or anything not what you want.
Yeah, I mean, that's how the Buddhists would understand it. So I think they might say that there's a lot more going on in your mind than maybe we realize. And so even if you
I've
think
never
you're really
experienced
happy, well, I mean,
I'm joking, of course.
Yeah, it's just an interesting question.
I've definitely seen you suffer before, so.
Because it's an interesting question, because it seems like the whole of Buddhism is based on this idea that we suffer. And so if you went to the Buddha and said, well, I don't suffer, what would he say? I don't know. Interesting.
I get the sense, just from...
He'd punch you or something, right?
Well, maybe. We'll see. Maybe it's the one thing he'd get angry at, right? Like he's completely peaceful in every other situation.
Suffering.
What if he hits you, but it turns out you enjoy it?
Yeah.
And just, whatever he does, you're just really happy about it.
Yeah,
that'll be enlightenment, isn't it?
Next time I see an enlightened person, I'll try that. I mean, the Buddha talks about how like there's very specific states of meditation that are supposed to be like really blissful. Like these are the happiest kind of experiences that you can have. And he says that even in those experiences, there's suffering. And I think the suffering in those experiences exists because you know in the back of your head that it's going to go away. And I think I definitely experienced this. Like when you're really happy about something, there's always there's a kind of that like feeling that you get in your stomach that this isn't going to last. So I think they would say that deeply we are, not only is suffering something that we have a tendency towards, but it's something that's kind of always there.
As a utilitarian, I would say that the way I've sort of come to conclude about what I think probably makes most sense as maximizing happiness would be making kind of finding stable happiness, as it were, like happiness that isn't necessarily going to go away. That's what I've always sort of thought in my personal life is like something that is at least long term, if not sort of permanent, in terms of its ability to make me happy. Obviously, I'm never going to get rid of everything that makes me sad, so there's going to be that as well. But
would you say that's better than being even happier than, like, potentially you could be thinking about the future and being like, right, I'm going to try and be happy for this week and do this thing which I hope will bring me happiness for this week.
That's not really what I mean.
Rather than in the moment being like, this is making me happy, I want to do this to make me the happiest I can be in the moment.
That's not really what I mean. I mean, so I think obviously when people say sort of live in the moment, that's sort of fine and true and wonderful, but also if you just live in the moment and you don't worry about the future at all, then at some point that's going to come back to bite you and the future goes to cack. And so it's kind of a nice balancing act, right? So you try and live in the moment. It's not like I'm trying to say, oh, I'm going to be happy for this long period of time, but I try and seek happinesses, as it were, pleasures, sort of purposes that are going to last. That's why I sort of don't really rate a chocolate bar, because you're really happy when eating a chocolate bar. But, you know,
I think a lot of people, just from general observation, myself included, that people, they have this idea of happiness as something that when you attain it, you're in sort of a constant state of pleasure or in positive emotion. And I'm not sure if that's the best way of defining happiness. I'm not sure if that's one, attainable, or two, the best way of like defining what happiness actually is. And I think what the Buddhists, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not an expert on it at all, but I think how they sort of define it is that you almost divorce what happiness is from the feelings of pleasure and pain. So I think that you can feel pleasure and pain when you're happy, but it doesn't affect your internal sense of sort of happiness, sort of yourself.
One thing I will say as well, while we're at it with the Buddhism thing, is, and that, you know, there are some meditative states that make you feel super happy, is they've measured that. They've measured Matthew Ricard, who's a big, very famous French Buddhist monk, meditating on compassion, and it's the happiest they've ever recorded a human being.
Interesting. Do you know how they've judged like the happiness there?
By quite a long. Well, a same measure. It's not an exact measure, but it's brain activity in the areas of the brain we associate with happiness. And it was just completely off the charts. So it almost, almost certainly, I would say, works. You know, at making people happier. He's known by science as the happiest man alive.
Yeah. I mean, I think Buddhism is really interesting when it comes to the utilitarian question, right? Because I think on the surface, and a lot of people, I mean, a lot of scholars think that Buddhism is utilitarian fundamentally, because the Buddha would constantly keep saying that he's here to end suffering, and that suffering is the kind of primary thing that he's talking about. And so then everything in Buddhism can be defined in terms of suffering. And that seems very much like utilitarianism. I think specifically like negative utilitarianism, which is a form of utilitarianism that says that instead of trying to maximize pleasure, all we're trying to do is minimize pain. That kind of seems like utilitarianism. But I think, and perhaps in a kind of formal sense, right? So in the most abstract sense, that's true. But like if you look at the practicalities of how the Buddha like tried to encourage people to end suffering, it was in like a very different way than the like Bentham and Mill and the kind of Western utilitarians, in that he wasn't trying to get people to act in a certain way that would sort of maximize these like external conditions, but he saw suffering as arising in the mind, and specifically suffering comes out like very systematically. He thinks of this as coming out from craving, of tanha, of thirst, literally meaning thirst, right? So it's that sense of desire. And so then the kind of process of minimizing suffering is one where instead of like, it's not about moral action, but it's also about psychology. It's also about cultivation. And so developing virtues, developing like your own internal virtues is a way of ending suffering. So it then ends up looking like a lot more like deontology and virtue ethics, even though it's kind of founded in this utilitarian-esque principle. So I think it's interesting. I think Buddhism is perhaps a case where the big three different kind of moral theories, deontology, virtue ethics, and consequentialism, all sort of seem to come together, because like Buddhism can sort of be seen as any one of them.
Can you explain virtue ethics? I missed that in my intro.
Yeah, I mean, in my understanding, virtue ethics is just saying the good is what's virtuous. And so
kind of stoicism, I guess, or am I missing that?
I think the Stoics would have probably been virtue ethicists. I think it's generally sort of the work of Aristotle and like the Nicomachean Ethics that is the kind of source text of virtue ethics. But yeah, it seems like it's rather than trying to find a principle that could determine whether each and every action is good or not, it sort of says that the locus, the place that we look when we're looking for virtue, or if we were like trying to consider moral questions, shouldn't be these like individual acts or these questions like the trolley problem, but it should be people and about like cultivating virtue. And so then then I guess for them, the best thing to do would be what the most virtuous person does. Yeah, and I tend to be more of a virtue ethicist. I think out of all of the systems, it's the one I like.
Yeah.
So almost deriving kind of morals from what you've seen as the most virtuous in existence, or
if the only virtue is making people happy, or am I misconstruing what a virtue is here?
I mean, Aristotle wouldn't think about it in terms of making. I mean, he has this sense of eudaimonia. So there's this word eudaimonia, which is like translated as flourishing. And that seems for Aristotle to be like the ultimate goal of humanity, of what it means to be a human. So in a sense, yeah, I think virtue ethics does have this kind of sense of like trying to maximize happiness in this broad sense, in this kind of flourishing sense. But it doesn't try and do that by looking at individual actions and saying, okay, I have this one action, and is this action going to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number? It says, well, okay, I want to maximize happiness in the world, so then I'll encourage myself and other people to be virtuous. So yeah, that's my understanding.
Encouraging yourself and other people to find happiness from potentially different things, or less, or in a yeah.
I mean, Aristotle would have thought that it's like there's one thing, right? That he thought that the human being was like the rational animal. Well, there's two places. There's a kind of disagreement in Aristotle. It's like there's one point where he says the human being is the rational animal, and then there's one point where he says the human being is the political animal. You can't quite tell. Like there's a tension in Aristotle whether he likes politics or philosophy more. But for him, like the human being is a kind of thing, and so understanding what it means to be moral is to say like to be the best of that kind of thing. So just like a knife is made for chopping things, that's what defines a knife. The human being has a nature, and the end of that nature, the telos of that nature, the thing that nature is directed towards is eudaimonia. So for him, there is like one set thing for what it means to be happy.
So there kind of is an objective truth out in the world of what it means to be a human and what can.
Yeah, he would say so.
Like
I think a really good
ideal.
Sorry.
A Platonic ideal, I guess, but I mean, I know he probably would himself, having known Plato, might not.
I think Plato is quite different in a way, like because Plato doesn't ground the good in a sense of what it means to be human. Plato grounds the good in the good, because he has this sense of the good as like this kind of abstract form of the forms, because you abstract forms out of these individuals, things that you see, and the thing that's the most abstract, the thing that sort of starts all of intelligence is the good in itself. And so if you want to figure out how to be good for Plato, you look to the good, whereas for Aristotle, if you want to figure out how to be good, you look to a human being, what it means to be a human being. So yeah, it's interesting. It's slightly different for both.
Yeah.
Okay, so talking about Plato and Aristotle.
The boys.
Indeed.
Which one of them is literally like known as the philosopher? That's Aristotle, right? I need to brush up stuff. That's a pretty cool nickname to go down in history with.
Indeed.
It's not bad.
Yeah, well, he messed up quite a lot of things with science, because we couldn't get rid of Aristotle for about 1,500 years.
Yeah.
Galileo to say this guy wasn't actually talking about anything very useful for science.
Fair enough.
I only know what they say in Legally Blonde.
What's that?
I go like, who said this thing, and it's Aristotle, and that's about where my knowledge ends.
Do you remember what the thing was?
No, I just know his name features in the movie.
Do you not remember having to read Plato in first year architecture for James Campbell?
Oh, he did.
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
Do you remember what you read?
It was about shapes and forms, and I did not understand much of it because like when you don't have the background knowledge of what they're talking about, you're just like, why are you talking about like these 5 perfect shapes that there are in the world?
There's 5 perfect shapes.
I think it was 5. Something about like the Platonic.
Till you're one of them.
Forms.
Oh, okay, man. I was waiting. I was fishing for that. I was like,
Yeah. I mean, you spoke about other things as well, but I don't particularly remember. But would you say that both of them thought there was some kind of objective to be found by humans?
Yeah, I think they both did. I don't think it's really up till like the modern West, perhaps. Maybe Nietzsche is one of the first that I can think right now. That this idea that morality is something completely subjective and that we can make it up ourselves, and that really to be the best moral person is to invent morality yourself. Like that idea is very recent, I guess, in the history of humanity.
It's not.
Yeah.
Is it not Buddhist in a sense? In kind of, I might get this wrong, but idealism in a sense.
Oh yeah, interesting. I mean, the connection there is quite interesting.
Someone explain to me what idealism means in this context, because as I understand it, it's just any ideal and someone follows it.
no.
And it sounds like it's not that. Like there's a set meaning for it. It's not that at all.
Like, still, what did you mean by when you said that you were like thinking that you're an idealist? What did you mean?
I guess there's like a philosophical definition, kind of, as I understand it, which I think is probably different, as you say, from your definition, Rob. Is where basically like anything is kind of is dependent on the activity of the mind. Is how I understand it. Which I think potentially is quite a Buddhist idea that you cannot
just repeat that. Everything's dependent on the activity, not the mind.
Of the mind.
Oh, okay, yeah, that changes things a lot.
So is it that there's not really an objective reality? It's how you perceive things sort of makes.
Yes, exactly. That's how Aamir probably has a much better definition.
No, I mean that's great.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But is that not quite a Buddhist idea? And does that, if so, does that not relate to the idea that you kind of create your own morals in a sense?
It's interesting. So there's a particular Buddhist, well, there's I think the 2 particular Buddhist schools that would call themselves idealists in that sense. So Buddhism is kind of split broadly into like Mahayana and Theravada. Mahayana is sometimes been called like Northern Buddhism. So that's like China, Tibet, Japan, and like Theravada, like Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. And within the Mahayana, there's one school called Yogacara, and then there's another kind of smaller school. And so they both think that, well, yeah, I guess that most people would describe them as idealists in that they don't believe that any external object exists. They think that everything that exists has to be perceived in order for it to exist, that we couldn't have anything existing that isn't perceived. And note that like Buddhists think that the mind and thought is an object, is a sense organ. So they have like 6 senses instead of 5. And so, yeah, they're idealists in that sense, and that they don't think there's any external anything external to consciousness. But they have a lot of arguments for the existence of other consciousnesses. So a big thing that this one guy called Dharma wants to argue, even though he's an idealist, he thinks that everything exists only in consciousness. He thinks that there are other consciousnesses, and it's not just one consciousness. And because consciousnesses can suffer, then, and he thinks that morality is connected to suffering, then morality is important, and it's not just about what I decide, because there are these really existing other consciousnesses and they suffer, and so there is a kind of objective morality in that sense. And
the idea that there's these other consciousnesses, you said like not just one consciousness. Is there other forms of Buddhism that think about it in one consciousness? Or because one thing I understand about Buddhism particular is that everything is connected.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that like particular school, I think Dharma Kirti wouldn't like a lot of Buddhists. It's interesting. I think in the West we have this idea that Buddhism teaches like everything is one, and that we're all like part of this one unitary reality, and it's all beautiful. And you know, I got into it through that lens, right? So I'm totally a culprit too. But like as I've been studying more, I kind of realized that a lot of Buddhists haven't really, like, at least in their philosophical arguments, haven't really seen it that way. There is like one kind of border school, something called the Tathagata Garbha, which literally means the womb of the Buddha, not the womb of the Buddha, or the Buddha womb, which is called Garbha, means like womb or matrix or like seed. So that they kind of believe that reality is the womb of the Buddha, in that it's this kind of consciousness, absolute single reality that has the potential for creating Buddhas, and we all kind of exist within it. So that's a bit more on that side. But yeah, I think at least a lot of Buddhists wouldn't really think in those terms, and they think in terms of like individual consciousnesses that are having their own experience.
I guess it's quite obviously very different from sort of, especially I guess me and Rob, I guess we're quite similar in this, that there is, like, coming from the science tradition, which is sort of very intrinsically Western, we're very set on sort of an objective reality, sort of physicalism, determinism, sort of all of that. That's very much part of our worldview.
Yeah, I would say that's the most likely truth,
yeah,
given the current evidence. Yeah.
And so how would you guys, like, bringing it back to morality, maybe, like, how would you guys think about morality? Like, how would you ground it? Do you think it's something completely up to the individual to sort of create on their own terms?
I wouldn't say it's individual. Like, I guess it's sort of, I think, yeah, one I think it's really interesting how, like, I don't know too much about morality. It's not really what I've studied, but it's amazing how quickly it comes back to sort of the metaphysical foundations of, like, how you think about sort of reality and the structure of reality and everything. It's interesting how closely it comes back to that. And I think for me, as a sort of, I guess, a physicalist, sort of mental states, and physical states, all of that sort of objective reality, I guess it is just sort of a product of human interaction, and it's about sort of relative, like, what makes people, I guess it's almost politics in a way, is what do people think is good to do for other people, and how do people interact in a society in a way that's beneficial? I guess it comes down to that more than something individual.
But so, like, if I push you there, so do you think that there's suffering, that, like, maximizing happiness? Because it seemed like in the last thing that you were saying that there was a sense of, like, what benefits society. Is that like good regardless of what people say? So say I said that I don't care about the good of society, I just care about my own good. Do you think that I'm morally wrong? Do you think that you could say anything to argue against me?
I guess, well, I wouldn't say there's anything fundamental sort of completely set that would sort of go against that.
Can I jump in and just say what I think, and then kind of you criticize both, Aamir, because I think mine sort of potentially touched on that, and I also kind of am interested to hear your criticisms of mine, and I'll forget otherwise. So I probably am a bit of a physicalist and a determinist in what I think the world is likely to be. I don't necessarily fully believe that, but I think that's probably the likely outcome given the current evidence. And I do know that I feel good sometimes and feel bad sometimes. And as it happens right now, I'd say I feel good most of the time and occasionally feel bad. And I think and kind of assume that other kind of creatures, I wouldn't limit it to just humans, also feel. And if they feel good, that's intrinsically good. And I'd like to think that maximizing that good is kind of the only real positive. And while other creatures might have different motivations for good and different ways of coming to their own decisions of what are good, they are all, well, anything that is capable of feeling that, to the degree that they're capable of feeling that, that has worth. And so as far as kind of other things making decisions, like there's obviously going to come into some conflict if one kind of free thinking entity, free feeling entity, whether they're free independent feeling or group feeling or not, I don't really know. But if something feels and the motivation to feel would be to harm others, then you're just kind of tallying up what's worth more. This is kind of the discussion we had last week with, if you've got one positive gaining benefit from destroying or harming a bunch of other kind of positives, then that's going to be a net bad. So doing damage in society, even if it's good for that one individual, I would probably say is wrong, because you're doing damage to multiple other individuals, and each individual is a kind of
this is essentially utilitarianism, and this is basically what the ideas that Bentham was having coming out of the Enlightenment, coming out of this proliferation of secularism, sort of scientific practice. It's that if you don't have any sort of external criteria for morality, how do you set it up? And I think, like Bentham said, basically, is broadly, if you want to be sort of maximizing utility, like if more people feel good, then that is a good thing. If more consciousness is,
yeah, I don't want to. I know it's a pedantic point, but I really don't want to limit it to just people, because I think animals.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, like
if
there are
a computer
obviously
could feel, then a computer.
Other minds, yeah, and then that obviously developed into sort of the idea of political economy and sort of politics, economics, two separate subjects. Is how do you allocate resources? How do you build a society? How do you sort of structure sort of human social interaction in a way that maximizes utility or maximizes experiences of pleasure and happiness?
Aamir, tear that apart. Go on.
I don't agree. A lot of things, to be honest, might be disappointing, but yeah, like I disagree with the physicalism, but perhaps that's a separate discussion.
No, we'll hear it.
Emma's very keen to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of topic that I tend to think about a bit more as well. But yeah, so I guess I disagree with the physicalism, and then with the utilitarianism, I agree in this kind of broad sense that I think that morality is about consciousness, and I think that it's conscious beings. Like Buddhism has this term sentient beings, right? So like about the animals point, it doesn't limit it to human beings. It has this thing that anything that's sentient, anything that's conscious.
Sorry, not just animals, but computers as well, if they could ever get to that point. Or
essentially,
well,
yeah, I'm sure the Buddha would have been done.
A whole other.
I know. I'm deliberately kind of poking the bear there, but
no, I think it's a good point. It's probably quite a relevant one, right? Like in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, I forgot what I was saying.
I'd be interested to hear about your disagreement with physicalism, because coming from sort of a Western analytic sort of tradition, my idea is that like the things that can't be hypothetically couldn't be physical are mental states, but for me, mental states have a physical underpinning. Mental states are physical states, therefore we're fine, basically. So that tradition sort of psychology, cognitive science, then physicalism is absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Maybe. Although we did get into debate about this last week.
Yeah, it's a really good debate. And you'll just go around in circles and circles and circles.
Exactly. I think that's
Yeah, but it's really a good one, I think, because it's so meaningful, I think.
I do want to hear your point though. So before we say it's meaningless, please do actually say what you think of physicalism.
Well, it's funny that you say you see no evidence for anything else. I see no evidence for physicalism. What possible evidence could you give me? So, okay, I mean, let me flesh that out. It's a big claim. So perhaps there's two things, right? One is this idealist argument made by Dharma that I was talking about before, which is basically the similar argument to a guy called Bishop George Berkeley, who is a philosopher. I don't know exactly when, I think like maybe in the 19th century sometime. He was an Irish guy. And his sort of big motto was in Latin, esse est percipi, which means to be is to be perceived. Right? So, I mean, this is a classic argument, I guess, and it leads into like solipsism and all of these other things, but it's the question of like, how can we ever know that there's anything outside of consciousness? Because everything that exists, everything that we see, everything that we use our senses to perceive exists within consciousness.
Or how can we even know consciousness is the thing as well? It might all be a kind of, I mean, we think we're aware that we're aware, but
I think we're pretty set on that. So cogito ergo sum, going back to Descartes and that.
Yeah, no, I agree, but I'm just being pedantic.
Yeah.
I can't even be totally sure.
If, you know, like consciousness is what's right in front of you, perhaps I would say. I would sort of say that we're conscious and that's it. And if science can't explain it, then that's science's fault, not my fault, because it's the only thing that I know. And it's the only thing that's right in front of me. So I think, yeah, if we're like playing this game of going down to the most like ground level of things that we can know, I would sort of say that consciousness is that. And if you disagree, then I perhaps have little to say.
Yeah, no, well, I think there's a lot to unpack with consciousness. But I think
we have nearly 5 hours of content prior to this, perhaps discussing whether we agree or not. So
I didn't think it touched on this though.
No, it didn't touch on this side.
Yeah.
No.
I think, I think we sort of slightly touched on it, but I think for me that there is some, so consciousness is underpinned by physical processes. We don't know necessarily what physical processes they are, but there is some sort of general sort of interaction between sort of physical systems that leads to sort of emergence of consciousness.
Why do you think that? Why do you think that consciousness is underpinned by physical processes?
Because it, I think you need, that's a very good question. I think it comes from, it's sort of, it goes back to the metaphysical. I don't think there's anything, it's sort of science. If you can't sort of observe it, if there's no sort of observation of it, then it's not a sort of something that's worth explaining in sort of science. But you can observe you can't observe consciousness directly, but you can observe your own consciousness directly, and you can infer it in other people, and therefore that makes it sort of something worthy of sort of scientific exploration.
For me, there are kind of two avenues I could go down here. The first is how you kind of arrive at a conscious creature through evolution, or like, you know, different steps of what I would deem something to be conscious through evolution. And the second is, which is something I think we've already stated in prior podcasts, is kind of the reason I assume physicalism, or not physicalism, but the reason I assume to kind of adhere to that is because I think as I've said earlier, if you can't measure something, then it's sort of, I find it hard to see how it has any meaning. And so I would only, it's not that I don't think the other stuff exists, I just think it's sort of irrelevant.
It's outside scientific knowledge, which is fine. There's stuff that can exist outside scientific knowledge. But
it's just not stuff I'm therefore interested in.
Interesting question. So when you say if things aren't measurable, then they can't exist, are you saying that they can't exist?
No, not that they can't exist, but that I'm just not interested in their existence.
Well, perhaps then I'd say that consciousness is something that you'll never be able to answer using that framework.
Except that you potentially can.
So, so then this kind of comes to like the second big argument, which is the hard problem of consciousness, which I think like on the little bit that I looked at like last week's podcast, you guys touched on.
We talked about the hard problem a bit.
Yeah, but that's just the kind of impossible, like logical problem in my mind of how any physical process that is a third person scientific description of, you know, some sort of interaction between objects could ever give birth to the kind of unique first person sense of experiencing the qualities of things. And
can I have a go in explaining that?
Yeah, go for it.
As I understand it through evolution. So, I mean, if you've got evolution is very core, at least this is kind of what I got out of it, is the processes of that which continues best continues. And it's not necessarily applicable to just organisms and creatures, but it's any sort of process, that which is, that state which continues most stably best is the one that goes on to continue. And at some point, some chemicals somewhere on Earth formed the very kind of beginnings of what we deem to be a cell in such a way that that was able to continue in its form and procreate and grow. And any changes that occurred to that, which, I mean, at this point we now call mutations, and it's sort of exclusively in genes. But at the time, any sort of changes that occurred to that enabled that changed thing to continue more effectively meant that that thing continued more. And it kind of, a bunch of changes happened, like we got DNA, we got a bunch of other cellular organelles, and they all started banding together, these cells, and we had multicellular organisms. And we'll skip over all that because that's a few lecture series we're not really interested in. And then we get to eventually they start being able to kind of, these multicellular organisms, one of the things they need to do to continue more effectively, and therefore one of the things that when it happens means they continue more, is they start being able to coordinate their cells within their body. And one of the ways to do that is through electrical impulses. And as you coordinate more these electrical impulses, they have to suddenly, over a larger, more complex organism, another change would be those electrical impulses and kind of coordinations being more coordinated in themselves. And you start getting kind of more complex kind of logics, which can form into a central nervous system, as it were. And then another thing that would enable that kind of thing to continue more would be to provide those kind of coordinations with a motivation. So if not only are they able to coordinate, but they're able to coordinate in such a way that, is to the kind of the furthering of the continuation of this organism, then that organism will continue more, and therefore that's just kind of intrinsic to the process. So suddenly you've added in this, there's good and bad, and then you start kind of having okay, well, now this organism is interacting, it's got this emotion, and it's kind of able to coordinate itself, and it needs to procreate, and at this point it's kind of having sex to procreate, so it needs to interact with other members of its species, and to further its interaction with other members of its species, it needs to understand, or it doesn't need to, but it will be a huge advantage, it would help it continue better and therefore continue more if it could understand that other members of its species also think and feel like it does. And it kind of, so a theory of mind is therefore something that helps it continue more. And suddenly you have this thing that's now able to coordinate and think, and it's emotional, and it has theory of mind, and it's self-aware. And then the kind of another thing that, I mean, from kind of coordination, the furthering of that.
Sorry, can I just jump in for a second?
Yeah.
Where does self-awareness come from?
Well, if it's aware that other things can think of it, I probably skipped over that. If it's aware that other things can think of it, then it has to be aware that it exists.
Yeah. Okay.
No, so that's probably where self-awareness is probably a pre-step to theory of mind. And also, if it's aware of its own existence, that's also inherently beneficial in social interactions.
Yeah, perhaps we're sort of projecting a bit there onto the processes that you were describing, because if all that kind of mechanistic organism needs to do is continue, it doesn't need to know that it exists, or it doesn't need to know that other beings
No,
exist.
but it does if it's existing in
Yeah,
the it doesn't. It's beneficial to know that it exists if it's a social organism.
Well, it's beneficial for it to be able to perform the actions that interact the best. But I got, perhaps there's a bit of a leap being made when it comes to like knowing, that word knowing. Knowing that it exists and knowing that others exist.
Well, see, this is why I sort of think that we don't. I know we all think we know we're conscious, but we don't. I find there's a doubt in that we know we're conscious.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, that's a position I think often called eliminativism. There's a guy called Daniel Dennett, who's like a big proponent of this. And ultimately, consciousness is an illusion, and we think we're conscious, but we're not.
But then,
yeah. But
what is this thing? If we like, I find that quite fantastical.
Yeah, eliminative materialism is weird. There's all these people who convince themselves that they're robots, basically.
But yeah. I also kind of, when hearing you explain it like that, Rob, I was thinking the same things as Aamir in terms of it seems like a kind of unnecessary leap to get the self-awareness and the kind of consciousness that we know. But maybe I'm projecting.
But isn't it, if you're a social organism, right? And you've or maybe we go prior to being social. So you're roaming around. You're like a. I'm trying to think of a very basic animal because that's basically where we're at here. Like a kind of a fish that's not yet worked out. It can work in school. Not yet started working in like shoals. And there's predators and stuff, and eventually these two fish start going around together, and it kind of halves their odds of being eaten. And more fish band on because those fish that stick together continue more because they eaten less. And eventually you end up with a species where they're all banding together. And so working together becomes useful. And so if you're working together, it helps to know your position within. And so then becoming self-aware is a huge advantage.
I think at the moment, generally the jury's basically out on whether other animals are conscious apart from us. We have some evidence to suggest they might be, but it's not confirmed. So theory of mind's a good one. But there's good reasons to think that animals don't have sort of representations like we do. Like I think language is a really good one.
Not to the same degree we don't have language. Yeah, they don't have language, so they're not really as conscious, but I think they are. Yeah. It depends where you draw the line, but I think there are a bunch of lines that you can draw, and I would say they are less conscious but still conscious. But I mean,
but I think it's a bit of a minefield because you can say that obviously animals, if you hit a dog, it'll act as if it's hurt, and so you can say animals can feel, but you can also say they don't know that they're feeling. They just react in a way that they don't represent that feeling in a higher way. They just react in a way.
But you can also say something as humans.
This is
some people.
Well, I think we're a bit different. I think like I said, language is quite. So we're able to represent our feelings, and there's people who say that we only really sort of things that are like for the eliminative materialism. Like maybe one benefit is that the only things we really feel and conscious about are things we can put into language. Like there is that sort of thought that like the only things that like we can represent and what we can represent in language.
How would you test that though if you can only ever describe it to other people with language, because that's the only thing we have to describe it with?
Well, that's the whole point. That's why it's so hard to actually test these.
But the other thing so this is the problem I had the other pod when we were talking about kind of consciousness and why is it consciousness that's worth things, right? Is I think each of these individual steps within it in terms of emotion and being self-aware and kind of being able to make, I want to say rational or logical, but basically informed decisions and being aware that other things exist, they all have steps in the worth of that organism. And I'm not necessarily sure that it's like this nebulous consciousness, like that's set, or if that's kind of built up from kind of complex steps that all have their own worth and are kind of worth more when combined.
Yeah, I think perhaps like defining consciousness a bit is like useful, because when is one of those nebulous words, and like it's interesting because at one point it was said that having language makes you more conscious. So we have a sense of consciousness being connected to language, and we have all these different things.
And consciousness being something that can be more or less, rather than just a thing.
Yeah, and that's interesting as well. Like, yeah, can consciousness be more or less? I mean, I when I think about consciousness, I think I define it as a perspective on the world. So there is something it's like to be me. There is something it's like to be Rob. There is something it's like to be any like person. But there's nothing it's like to be a book. You know, like if you were a book, there wouldn't be something it's like to be you. So it's that sense of first person awareness, which perhaps doesn't have to contain language, perhaps doesn't have to contain even self-awareness. Perhaps all of these things are kind of additional accretions on consciousness. But all it is like subjectivity, like pure and simple, maybe even devoid of all of its contents. And it's interesting because I think if we define consciousness that way, then we really get at the hard problem. Because how could, like thinking about it on the neurological level, so we are brains and bodies, and where scientists try to look when they try and understand consciousness is the brain.
Very unsuccessfully.
Very unsuccessfully.
Well, yeah. We're getting there.
Are we there?
Well, I mean, I guess I was thinking neurobiology rather than psychology. Psychology is kind of looking at behavior really more than the brain.
Yeah, well,
behaviors. We've done pretty well with psychology, Max. I'm not bashing your stuff.
Yeah, psychology covers a lot. Psychology does cover. It's quite a broad term. It's broad church.
But the neuroscientists have got a lot of work cut out for them.
I think on this point, I think scientists can, sort of scientific knowledge can fully accept that we can't say, science can't explain what it's like to be someone. It can't say what is it like to be a bat. Science can't answer that question, and that's okay. The question that science can answer. So there's the easy problem, the hard problem. Like mentioned, so the easy problem is what are the necessary conditions in the brain for consciousness to arise. We don't have an answer to that, but we can answer that. Then there's this hard problem of what actually is consciousness as a thing, as a kind. Which is a hard problem. The first one?
How would we answer the first one?
Well, if it's not easy, but I think you can imagine a situation where we have a good measure of consciousness and we have a good measure of the physical processes that are occurring when consciousness is also occurring.
But how would you?
If you're saying,
but what are those physical processes? Aren't the physical processes like behavior and like human action and speech?
Well, the physical processes would be like sort of neurons firing. I think we're quite happy to narrow it down to that as the physical process, as the physical underpinning of when people are conscious. Because if people's neurons aren't firing, then they're not conscious. We know that.
I mean, do you think that I am conscious?
Yeah, I think so. I think so quite strongly.
So yeah. So if you can kind of just judge that. I mean, why do you think I'm conscious?
Well, it's abductive inference, isn't it? The most likely explanation is that you act as if you're conscious. You act like
so if we test that, then surely that's reliable. And if we test that alongside the physical processes, then
yeah, exactly. We have methods of conscious reporting.
I think the way I would judge whether you're conscious wouldn't be like I would look at your brain and see if there's neurological processes going on.
No, but as in you are judging now whether I'm conscious, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So if we can make that same judgment and also measure whether the physical processes are going on.
Yeah, exactly. This is what science, it's not easy, but you can imagine a situation where our theory and methods have advanced to the point where we have a good sort of valid construct of what consciousness actually constitutes and a good physical measure of what's going on.
So I think what we could do is we could do really well at figuring out the neural correlates for like people reporting certain experiences, but there will always have to be that reporting, right? Like, how do we know which parts of the brain are associated with happiness?
Ultimately, we have to trust our own reporting on consciousness.
Said they were happy. Sorry.
we have to trust our own reporting on our own consciousness, though.
Exactly.
At some point, we do have to assume. I mean, this is what I was saying in the last podcast. It's like the only reason I assume these things is because the moral consequences of not assuming them, if they are true, is worse than the moral consequences of assuming them if they aren't.
But like, I think this is a really important point for physicalism, because it seems like you guys are like accepting to an extent. There's a level in which there's an assumption, there's a bit of a leap being made, because we're relying on people's reporting. We like, consciousness isn't this thing that we could measure and that we could ever sort of figure out from just looking at the cell biology was sort of existing in there in the petri dish. So there is a bit of a leap being made. But I think for physicalism, it's an issue, because if there is this thing that can't be explained in like in the physical paradigm completely, and not only is it just one thing, but it is the thing, consciousness, that we're the one thing that we're sure of. And not only is it the one thing we're sure of, it's the one medium by which all scientific observation and study is created, right? Every single scientific thought, every single scientific observation happens within consciousness. So in some very fundamental way, science relies on consciousness.
But it's not just consciousness science can't know. It's like it's everything. To the same degree, it's everything. And the only reason you assume that you can do it is because if you assume you can't, then and you can't measure it, and it's not physical, then it has no, like, I know we've already busted head on this, but in my view, it has no meaning. So I choose to, because otherwise, I don't really see how anything has any value.
But why isn't everything just consciousness?
What?
Yeah, we talked about panpsychism, which is last week.
I don't in that sense. I mean, in the sense that in the sense of what I think idealism is, because it seems to me, listening to this, I had thought it's basically like you both talking about the same thing, because to me, is there much difference between the idea that everything is kind of physical and matter and explained by that, and everything is consciousness? Because they're not kind of both ways of explaining the world as we know it. And what's the difference? I mean, because you say if something can't influence the physical world, then it doesn't matter, and it kind of doesn't exist in the physical world if it doesn't have any kind of tangible influence on it. But if everything is consciousness, is it not still a way of kind of being influenced and perceiving and the world affecting you? Like what's
I mean, if the whole physical world is inside my head,
yeah, exactly,
and it's just my perception, then it's still just the physical world that's inside my head that matters to me. So yes, I could be an idealist as much as I am a physicalist, but I guess I'm not really sure which philosophical angle you think of it from or attack it from, or question it rather than attack. Attack's a nasty word, but they're probably both valid.
So do you see that as quite like a personal thing, Rob, in that like what matters to you as Rob is the things that you can measure, or do you think that no thing that was not measurable can ever exist, and so that's like what?
No, it's not that it can't exist. If something exists and it's immeasurable, then you can't. How can it have like a more or less? And if it can't have like a more or less, how can it be more or less good? Like, it can exist, sure, and that can be very true. It's just not something that I think you can take into account when it comes to making decisions and kind of having moral value. It's just something that is.
It seems to me that consciousness, which is the thing that you're saying, all of these words are existing in your consciousness. It's the basis for you to have made the decisions that you've made. It's the way that you've experienced the world, is something that you can't measure, fundamentally, because of this hard problem that we're sort of trying to articulate. And so perhaps that like throws a wrench in the works. If the one thing...
Let's just go at that again. So what do you mean we can't measure consciousness?
In that we wouldn't be able to develop any kind of scientific observational process that could figure out how, not.
Okay.
So it's interesting that the easy and the hard problem. perhaps we could develop some sort of answer to the easy problem. I can maybe conceive of that. But we'd never be able to explain how consciousness arose out of physical processes. There'd be no like explanation. Even if we could figure out when and where it happened, we'd never be able to explain why it happened. And that is a really important point, I think, because I think ideally in science, we'd want to be able to explain everything. We'd want to be able to explain the properties of objects by a causal process of how they acquired those properties. But we'll never be able to do that with consciousness. And I think for me, that's such a hard logical problem. It's such a problem that it isn't just an observational problem. It's not just a problem of acquiring more evidence. One day we'll get there. It's a logical problem. And if
it's something that's a problem for everything, right? We don't know we can measure anything.
Yeah, I think
on this, assume you can measure it, because if you can't measure it, then it has no value. Is my point. It's like I appreciate that, but I also can't actually measure distance. Like that's just my perception. That's what I'm viewing. Like, and that view might be incorrect and it might not be real. But if I don't assume that I can, then so it's an assumption I'm making, because if I don't make that assumption, then it has no meaning. And if it has no meaning, then I don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, interesting.
Do you know? Sorry, do you know what you're looking for exactly, Rob? When you say it can't be measured, like what is the measuring that you're?
As in anything that can't be measured, I don't think. What do you mean?
My sticking point with what you're saying when you say it can't be measured is.
Wait, what can't be measured?
Well, you say like it can't be measured, but are you looking for are you looking for a number, like an experiment, or you
something relative? So I guess eventually you could give that a number, but it's something that perhaps you'd not. Yeah, something that's maybe relative is the wrong word, but something like Mikey said at the beginning, where you can say there's this state and that state, and this state is greater than or less than that. You can't necessarily measure it precisely, but you can. You know,
can I just pose a question? I think that it comes down to Rob. You also saying that you don't think it can have meaning if you can't measure it. But I feel like Aamir, you're saying you can't measure it, and I'm not sure on my own opinions on this yet. However, would you like to explain how you think it still does have meaning, and maybe then Rob, you'll be like, maybe this does still have meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good way of going.
I mean, I think it has meaning in the sense that like consciousness is, but perhaps you could put it in this way, right? Like I could conceive if like a demon came to me and like said that it has to take like one thing away from me, I would give it like, I could possibly conceive of giving it anything except my consciousness. Perhaps that's the one thing that you could never ever be able to give up, right? Because if you gave up your consciousness, that would be the basis of your life. So it's meaningful in the sense that it allows everything else to be meaningful. Perhaps it's the one thing that without which there would be no question of meaning, there would be no consideration of meaning. So it's perhaps a precondition for meaning in the first place. And so without it, if there's a system that can't explain it, then that system is broken, because it is the one thing.
I'm sorry, I missed all of that. I missed literally all of that from the moment Sil stopped speaking.
Rob, that was the best thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, Rob, it's fine. You can go to bed now. We solved it.
We solved it.
Minute.
And I've actually
we're all happy
so
now.
I can't say it again. So.
Well, this sucks. I'm going to have to wait till the recording to be able to come out.
I'm sure.
Is there any chance you could repeat or kind of say succinctly what you just said? Sorry.
Well,
sorry to all the listeners who have to. It sounds like you don't really have to endure it twice. You can enjoy it twice, but it's coming up. Part 2.
I'm thinking like as I'm speaking, but perhaps the succinct way of putting it is that consciousness is the condition for anything to be meaningful, because you wouldn't be able to conceivably have anything of value without consciousness, because if there was no consciousness, there wouldn't be any experience at all. So if we're like asking the questions of what's meaningful, what's valuable. I think in every instance of value, there is always consciousness implicit, whether we say it or not. And so perhaps that's the sense in which I mean that it's meaningful.
But is it not both? As in, those are the two requisites for meaning. Is you need to have something observe, something that can be more or less.
Yeah, well, perhaps I think that's perhaps a different question. I mean, I would also say, like, on what you're saying, that it seems to me that the things that are like most meaningful in life, the things that we sort of find the most joy in, are things that precisely we can't measure in any sort of numerical way, at least. Perhaps you might say more.
Except that you find most joy in them, right? So you can measure you find more or less joy in those things. So the joy is measurable.
But the word measurement is interesting because we can't put a number on it. So we might find more or less. We have this kind of sense of being drawn to different places.
That's what I mean. But when I say measure, that's what I mean. Whether you want to say it's relative or something, another word. But I guess measure was just the word I was trying to put there for more or less, rather than, precisely coming up with a numerical value in our current capacity.
Yeah. But perhaps that distinction is really important because I think it's kind of at the heart of a lot of this. I think there's, Alan Watts has this great thing about gooey and prickly people. It's like in one of his lectures that I don't remember which one, but it's really worth watching. But he says that in the world, there's gooey and prickly people. And the gooey people are people who think that things are indeterminate, right? That you can't say precisely what they are. And the prickly people are the people who think that we should be able to say exactly what things are. And we should be able to kind of put a number on them and define them so that we can use them. And science is very much like a prickly thing. But I think like the humanities and the question of consciousness in general is fundamentally like a gooey issue in Alan Watts' terms. Because it's precisely the condition for any individual determinacy. And so it would never be able to itself be determinate. And so there's a way in which like science is always rests on this foundation of something that itself can't understand or prove. And so if you're using science as a justification for physicalism, well, that doesn't work because science itself rests on something that it hasn't proven. And so you're working in the air. You haven't reached the foundations.
I guess the way that, with a lot of caveats, the way that science works is that it takes the evidence and it gives the best explanation for that evidence. And in terms
assuming that there is evidence to take.
Yeah, well, you create the evidence and you create the explanation from that evidence. There's two parts of science. There's the measurement and experiment, and there's the theory and explanation. Those are two parts of science. You try and match them up as best as you can. And what the best explanation is, it's the one that is sort of the most likely, like what best explains what's happened given what we know already. And it's the one that's sort of most parsimonious. It's the one it keeps everything sort of simple and sort of like Occam's razor, sort of the most simple and straightforward explanation is the best one. And I think in terms of the questions we're asking about, is consciousness sort of part of, it's not, well, there's mental processes, but a mental process is part of sort of physical processes or arise out of physical processes, then the best explanation is yes, given what we know. That's what science is saying. Science is not about certainty, but so physicalism is the best explanation for what we know already and what we can observe and what we can collectively agree on.
Why wouldn't panpsychism be a better explanation?
Well, panpsychism could potentially be scientific.
There's
there's not a problem with that.
Going around called integrated information theory.
Yes, we talked about that last week. Yeah, but these are answers to potentially scientific answers to the hard problem, in which you're saying what kind of thing is consciousness, and if you can create a good theoretical construct which explains the evidence, then that's science. It doesn't have to be something that's it can be something more abstract than just sort of physical processes. But that is science, and that's how science works. The abductive process of going through what explains. You're not certain, but you explain everything as best as you can. and this is what we can say from the best of our knowledge.
But
that's not disregarding other forms of knowledge. So you can have sort of, you completely agree that sort of humanities and arts and everything else in religion has value, but the way that scientific, like the boundary of scientific knowledge, can go and explain a lot of what we see.
Yeah, I'd say the only time it doesn't have value is if science can kind of show using evidence that it, well, not that it doesn't have value, but if it potentially has maybe less value in my eyes, is if science can show that it's wrong, and frequently it can't and hasn't and isn't. But yeah, that's the only sort of time I'd say it comes into conflict of things.
Yeah, but I guess my point is that I think the question of consciousness in this sense, in the kind of hardest sense, and I think the most fundamental sense, is precisely not a scientific question. Because if you're asking the question of physicalism, like what evidence could science give? And I guess, so maybe in loads of other situations based on what we know, but I think always implicit perhaps, well, maybe not always, but in a lot of the times in scientific questions, an implicit assumption is that the world is physical. And the physical world is something like that's operated by certain natural laws that we can understand them. Those are assumptions that we use to do science, and they're not. I'm not saying that they're wrong necessarily, and that the whole of science is wrong. I mean,
or that they're not assumed for a good reason.
No, it is true. You're absolutely right in that they are assumptions, and and this is what the philosophy of science really developed as a subject. In that, when you try and analyze what science is, there's a question of what makes something science, what makes it non-science. It's not completely clear at all, and actually a lot of any explanation basically falls apart. And what you're left doing is basically applying the scientific method to itself and saying this is what is most likely given what we know, and that's the point we're at now.
Yeah,
but I'd almost say if you don't
think that it's more likely that that consciousness arises out of matter in like an epiphenomenalist way that we can eventually understand.
Well, I think consciousness can be causal. That's not necessarily a problem for physicalism. It doesn't have to be epiphenomenal. It's just that, because obviously mental states can cause physical states, but for that to be true, then there has to be physical states underpinning those mental states.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, well, what would that consciousness look like that would cause anything that happens, at least on the neurological level, right? If you zoomed into the level of the neuron.
Well, that is the question. There's some things, we don't have an answer, but there's some things going around. So the idea of sort of like I like the one of strange loops. Hofstadter, I think his name is, that basically these sort of consciousness is an idea that there's these self-referential systems, and the more self-reference you get, the more sort of emergent sort of complexity you get, basically, and out of that comes consciousness. So the idea of self-reference, so like if you point the idea he gives, if you point a camera attached to a video, like a screen, and you point it at the screen, you get all these crazy patterns on the screen. That sort of idea of self-reference is like, but that's like quite hypothetical. Yeah,
I mean, I think for a lot of these though, like it will just be, I mean, we can develop all sorts of theories like integrated information, this loop theory that might like theories about what physical processes would need for consciousness to also exist. But you'll never ever be able to explain how that physical process actually gives rise to consciousness. You're able to sort of, we're trying to like narrow our correlations, right? And sort of see exactly like, well, if this kind of set of atoms exists in this like formation, and we can understand the structure, then also consciousness exists. And you know, potentially we'd start. I mean, I don't know how you'd ever do it, because the only way that we ever know that people are conscious is by hearing them speak and like hearing them move and act and behave. So, you know, what would it look like to just have consciousness in a petri dish, and how would we ever?
And
know?
then we don't know, right?
Well, I think that's why something like integrated information theory is slightly different from that. So the idea of just sort of neural correlates of consciousness, in that it's going beyond that and is abstractifying the problem a bit, and it's saying what general properties of conscious systems are there, and what can we say? So can we point at something that isn't human, that doesn't have like overt or obvious sort of characteristic of consciousness and say, is that conscious or not, based on our sort of abstract theoretical position on what consciousness is, which is different from the sort of just like what causes consciousness in the human brain.
Yeah, it's tough. I don't know much about integrated information theory.
But I mean, as I understand, these assumptions,
it's probably
like
wrong. It's probably wrong. That's one thing.
assuming like physicalism and all this stuff, right? Like these, as I understand it, these assumptions are kind of necessary as a precursor to anything having any worth or meaning. So it's like I don't think that they're necessarily true, but I feel like I have to assume they're true before I can feel like anything has any worth or there's any morality.
I mean, it might be useful to sort of just try and articulate some different positive theories of what the world is that kind of makes sense of consciousness a bit more. So you could have like an idealist theory in perhaps the like I think what's often called subjective idealism, in that it all exists in your own head, in that everything that I experience is kind of like a hallucination that like my individual consciousness is making up. That's one form of idealism, and I guess that.
How does that have any meaning or bad or good or positive or morality?
Well, you might use that to question the existence of other beings, but I think other than that, I wouldn't have a huge amount. But there's like another kind of sense of idealism would be that rather than consciousness existing in your own head. I mean, this is perhaps another thing we can debate, because I don't think consciousness exists in the brain, and that's like another whole thing. Like, and I really don't think there's any evidence to say that consciousness exists in the brain. But like another kind of more positive like thing of theory of idealism would be that in some way, consciousness isn't something that is limited to the individual subject and everything out there is a projection, but somehow consciousness exists prior to subject and object, which is like a really hard thing for us to sort of get our head around. But there's a way in which there's a kind of process of interaction, or there's there's one single consciousness kind of gives rise to itself in terms of dualism of subject and object, and that consciousnness precedes both, and that consciousness is something the whole world participates in. So there's kind of theological ideas of like God as pure consciousness holding the world, and so the world of physicality exists, and it's understandable through science, but it exists in so much as it participates in this universal consciousness. So perhaps that would be.
But where is
the what? Sorry.
Where's the as much like if God's like, you know, you've got a universal consciousness, or you have like a kind of idealism and everything's perceived. Like, what I still don't understand where the good and bad in that is. Where's the morality?
I suppose this kind of question is, at least in my mind, somewhat disconnected from the question of morality. This is a question of like what fundamentally exists. You know, if you believe in God, then that will affect your morality and all sorts. But at least perhaps it gives you a grounding for morality, right? Because where would morality exist if things are only physical? Like, one way I think about physicalism is that if anything's physical, it has to exist in space and time. Where would morality exist? Like where in what place? It wouldn't really.
Yeah, see, this is the thing for me, is I'm not sure I've ever really been that concerned about whether knowing the truth. I would just want to know what's right, if there's something to be right, something to be good. I'm really not that concerned with whether it exists or not. But if something does exist in such a way that there's a good and a bad, then I'd best do what's right.
But if we're talking about good
and
and
if it
bad,
doesn't, then it doesn't really matter what I do. So it doesn't really matter. Existence is.
But you think what's logical is good, right? You want to be the most rational and coherent you can be, right? I assume.
I missed that. Sorry.
you want to be as rational and coherent as you can be, right?
I want to be as logical and coherent.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm just trying to say that physicalism, in the face of the evidence of consciousness, which is undeniable, is an incoherent position. So I think if you're using your criteria as rationality, as what's most coherent, I think that physicalism is incoherent. And so it is a meaningful debate for us to have.
I am literally not hearing most of the words you're saying, unfortunately.
Is that true?
I'm just getting.
Yeah, I would. So I think what I've argued is that it is. I think you're right to question the assumptions on which sort of physicalism is based. But I think there are valid reasons to, like, basically to follow it. But that doesn't mean there isn't other forms of knowledge or anything, sort of anything else. Like, just because I'm a physicalist doesn't mean I don't see other forms of knowledge as invalid. I fully accept there are other things you can sort of, like things you're talking about, so consciousness is outside of the universe or whatever, not my area, but that's not valid. For me, that's not a sort of a question for science, and that's fine. Well, there's an
interesting question of definition there, because when I'm talking about physicalism, I think I'm assuming that what that means is that the only things that exist are physical. So we can explain the entire world, everything that arises.
What do you mean by physical?
Well, that's another question.
It's all words.
I don't know, because I don't think physicalists have a very good definition of physicalism. I'm not a physicalist, so I don't really spend much time thinking about what the physical is.
Well, I think we can bound the physical world to what's within the universe, and everything that processes that arise out of everything that we can observe, and consciousness and mental states as well, arises out of processes that occur within the bounds of the universe and within the laws and sort of logic of the universe. Is essentially what physicalism is.
We should go into this. Like, what is physical? Can we try and think of the definition of? Because I think if you really try and push it, I think we'll end up at consciousness again. Like, what could the physical be? So we could have a sense of it as stuff, right? As some kind of fundamental goo or matter that is at the basis of the universe. But it seems like when you kind of get to really small level quantum mechanics, what you're describing through equations. You're describing through stuff like the Schrodinger's equation, which is a list of numbers and symbols. So it seems to me that the most basic understanding we have of what is physical is an equation. And what is an equation? Equation is a symbolic representation of a mathematical truth. Maybe it was a bad way of putting it. But if the most fundamental thing that exists is an equation, then what are we talking about? When we're talking about the physical.
Yeah, I think there are some interesting questions to ask about sort of the role of mathematics in describing the natural world. But I think broadly, as well, science is fairly sort of based on the assumption that there's an objective reality, and what's bounded by that objective reality is what is physical, essentially, which is the universe. We seem to have a fairly good idea. I used to be a physicist, not anymore, but last time we had a fairly good idea of what the universe was, I'm pretty sure.
I think it's very deeply ingrained that we can break it down into fundamental particles that make up the material world and the universe as we know it.
Can we pause a sec? I think Rob's having Wi-Fi difficulties, and will be rejoining.
Cool.
Funky stuff, man.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh, this is epic. I feel like I've been surrounded by many scientists in having these debates.
Can't believe Rob is missing the best parts though.
I know, it's sad.
Yeah.
We've
got to say something just I don't know, we've got to have something to say when he comes back, just something just completely throw him.
Yeah.
I'll have a thing.
Yeah. Is he attempting to rejoin now, Aamir?
I haven't got like a notification or anything. Sorry, but fuck me, this bourbon is incredible. It's a vibe.
It's good. It's good. He says he's rejoining. He said maybe we could try a different host. That might help his Wi-Fi.
Would that help?
Yeah,
he's in the Netherlands, isn't he? Well, he's not. He's in. There we go. Yeah.
Oh, he's back. Hello.
Oh. Can you hear us?
Right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know if this will hold. I think other people in my house are using the Wi-Fi. But for the last like, I don't know, half an hour, you've been progressively less audible.
Well,
unfortunately.
Just your consciousness fading away, Rob.
It was never real anyway.
Yeah.
Consciousness
That's
isn't
what
actually
happens when you become a physicalist. You really start believing it, you just sort of lose your consciousness.
You just become, this is just a natural progression to limited materialism where you become a robot.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with being a robot, as long as the robot has emotions.
What is emotion, though? That's a question. That's something completely different.
That's the thing, is feeling of good or bad, or other things as well. I guess you can have social emotions, but broadly, it's a feeling.
What's a feeling?
Well, that's personal to you.
Some neurological underpinning, probably.
Supposedly, it might not be personal to me, it might be to everyone, and actually the personal thing is only something that's been introduced to Western philosophy recently, as you said earlier, but
as in, I'd also like to continue on the vein of, because I know, Aamir, you said this, and I think a lot of Buddhists think this as well, that consciousness doesn't actually subside in the brain.
Yeah, it's a cool one. I like this one.
So I think me, Max, and Rob have all done neurobiology, and Max is still a psychologist, and be very interested to hear this.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can sort of my understanding is that although the brain might be a necessary condition for consciousness, so we do need it for consciousness to exist, at least in the human form. It's not a sufficient condition. So the classic thought experiment of a brain in a vat, right? That we could have a brain in a vat and we could feed it all sorts of electrical like impulses, and it would really like, and the consciousness would somehow reside in there, and that person would not realize that they were in a vat. I don't think that necessarily proves that consciousness resides in the brain. And I think it's like a question of locality. Like, I don't think that the place where consciousness is inside the brain. I think the brain is part of a process that involves the brain, the body, and an environment that in turn creates consciousness. I think consciousness comes out of the interaction of a brain using a body in an environment. So it's like the whole event together creates this conscious thing. And I don't see any argument that could convince me. I've never faced one.
So
why
Mikey said before, when we've talked about this exact brain in a vat idea, and he's like, well, surely if you had that brain and you put into it all the impulses that would arise from the rest of the body and from the environment, what would the difference be?
Yeah, so I think that brain might not be aware that it's in a vat. It might not be aware that it's like, it might have a conscious experience very similar to the one that I'm having now. But what you haven't described is a brain alone. You have to think about logically. I mean, if we think about this thought experiment a bit more, we think about the implications. That what's feeding the signals in? There'll have to be this kind of set of computers that will figure out exactly what signals to send at the right time. So what you haven't described is the brain alone. You've described a brain accompanied by a system that's pouring in information. So I don't think that there's evidence to suggest that. And coming back to the sense of locality, it's not that the brain isn't necessary. The brain is necessary, but it's not that it's somehow inside there, right? That it's kind of spatially contained within my skull. The skull isn't some sort of special membrane the things going through the skull somehow enter my consciousness. There's loads of things going on whenever we talk about a conscious experience. There's a brain, there's a body, there's all sorts of things happening. I think we need to look at all of those things. Looking for consciousness in the brain is like looking for the value of money in the note, right? It's like looking at a £5 note and trying to find the value of money in the £5 note by looking through a microscope. Well, you'll never find the value there. Like it's in the context in which money's used. We use money in a whole society that like values money, and that's where you'll find the value. And consciousness is the same. It's like looking for like.
Why does it matter if it's in the brain or not?
Sorry?
Why does it matter if it's in the brain or not? I missed that part.
Well, perhaps it doesn't. But I think it maybe changes our sense of consciousness.
I think it also.
This is something I do actually agree that there's this movement towards sort of embodied cognition in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, where you're not just looking at processes in the brain, it's the way the brain interacts with the environment around it, basically. Which is exactly what Aamir said. So yeah, I think this is fair enough. The idea of consciousness is just neural processes doesn't really make sense necessarily. And you can sort of see it yourself, like when you're writing stuff down, you're interacting with your phone, when you're putting stuff on your phone, that's information storage, and that's information interaction between the physical world and your brain, which is essentially what consciousness is. It's a cognitive process involving the environment, which is something needs to be explained.
Yeah, totally.
Reminds me of what Esther Perel says about how you are your relationships. Like obviously she talks about it more in terms of like personal interaction between people, but everything is basically a relationship. I don't know what the difference is though between mind and consciousness. Like are they separate definitions, or are they the same thing?
Well, I was thinking, I still don't think we've very much defined consciousness.
Well, yeah, I think no, it's a good question, Zoe. I feel mind is, I'm not sure. I have the sense that mind is sort of stumped. It's sort of like the abstract of it's the abstract of something. I see it as the abstract of sort of physical processes in the brain, but that's not what everyone thinks. In that there's this whole world, the mental states, there's this whole world of interacting sort of things going on in the mind, basically, which we can study sort of physically, but it's a separate thing you can't observe directly.
Yeah, I mean, I think of mind as like consciousness and all its contents, right? So like all of the things that are going on when we're being conscious. Whereas consciousness is the thing, it's kind of like the mirror in which everything's reflected. So the image of consciousness as a mirror is like a very common one in Indian philosophy. So the mirror itself would be consciousness, but like things are reflected in the mirror. And so we are experiencing things, we're experiencing happiness, sadness, and objects in the external world. And that's all within the mind, maybe, is how I'd understand it. So, and that's an interesting distinction, right? Because I think maybe like mental content, a lot of what is like actually going on in my head, a lot of the emotions that I'm feeling, the things that I'm perceiving, we could use all sorts of neuroscience and stuff to like figure out, to maybe like explain it, and we could really get the correlates down. And so I could imagine that you could poke a stick in my brain eventually and get me to sort of think that I'm seeing a banana. But what I don't think you will ever be able to do is understand why I'm experiencing the banana in that first place. So we can explain the things that are reflected in the mirror, but we can't explain what this mirror is, why that mirror is there. And that's what causes me to reject physicalism.
Why does consciousness matter then? This is something I've really been struggling with. Because to me, it's like emotion matters intrinsically because it just seems to me.
You can't have emotion without consciousness, though. Yeah. You can't just have pure emotion. You need something to perceive that emotion, basically.
Rob, you missed Amir's explanation, but it was something to do with you can't give away the one thing you wouldn't want to give away is your consciousness.
But as in, what does consciousness mean then, though? Because like if you've got you can have like flies that aren't self-aware but do feel emotion, right?
Well, they don't feel emotion. They just experience. They don't experience. They just have a physiological reaction to external stimuli.
Or maybe they do experience. We don't know.
Yeah. Well, the jury's out. Maybe they do.
Yeah.
Probably flies. Maybe
I think
not.
they probably do. I kind of get a sense they might. It's interesting. So, who thinks flies are conscious? Like, should we do a vote?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
What?
We're
So
doing
who
a vote to see if flies.
I think so. I think yes.
Who thinks flies are conscious? Vote yes or
Oh,
no.
I'll say yes.
So if we're voting yes, put your hand up.
Can we have a third option for it's irrelevant?
No.
No.
or even it's complicated? I think they are part conscious.
That would be a form of consciousness, I'd say.
Yeah.
I don't think flies are conscious. I think corvids and or like crows and some apes potentially might be conscious. And
Some
octopuses as
Wow.
well.
That's fascinating. So you don't think a dog is conscious?
But it's just where you draw the
Limited.
frigging line. It doesn't matter. I agree with Max and I agree with you guys.
It's a complicated question, but I think it's quite an important one, right? Because if we
important.
come back to this
I
thing,
think it's just a definition of a word that I don't think means that much.
No, I think it's very important. I agree with that one.
It kind of feels like to say it's meaninless
It
feels
is an
like
important
too
question.
easy
I
to
think
escape.
But to say,
Yeah.
do you think there's a line in the sand of consciousness? Where
there's not. I don't think there's a line in the sand. I don't think something like an orangutan, while it might be conscious, it's not going to have the same sort of sophistication of conscious content as we do. But it might have some form of self-representation.
But even if there's a scale, right? Even if some things have less consciousness, that would still mean it's conscious, right? At what point do they not become conscious? There's one point.
I think just from the evidence we have currently, I'm very willing to change my position. I do sort of work off the sort of precautionary principle that, like I treat my dog. I have dogs. I treat them as conscious, basically. But I think that's an element of sort of anthropomorphizing them rather than they're actually conscious.
This is the thing. So
well, I don't hurt them. I don't hurt them because I don't think they're necessarily conscious. Because sort of precautionary principle, you don't want to. Yeah.
Yeah, is it really because you don't think they're necessarily conscious or a precautionary principle, or is it just because that's what you feel, you do, that's how you react in the moment? Like,
well, I also think
it's important.
If I hurt them, they do feel pain. They just don't represent that feeling of pain.
But if they're feeling pain, then they have to be conscious, right? Because I think
they. Well, yeah, they're not experiencing pain, but they show a pain reaction.
So can you feel pain without experiencing pain?
No, but I guess they show yeah, they don't have the representation of the pain. They don't have the pain and think, oh,
it's like
I'm
a robot. It's like a robot kind of reacting in like a scared way. Maybe.
Yeah, sort of thing. They have the reaction of pain, and they have the physiological reaction, but they don't necessarily sort of have a higher order representation of that pain.
So the way I've heard it described, on a guy called Sean, I can't remember his second name. John Carroll.
Oh yeah.
The physicist.
Yeah. And he did a very interesting podcast about morality, and he started off by just talking about morality in general, and then he used the example of, is it wrong to kill animals, as a kind of door to open into a lot of these kind of moral questions. And the way that he theorized about like animal consciousness is the idea that, so an animal can, he's an example of like taking your cat to the vet. In the moment that you get out the cat carrier, your cat knows that it's going to the vet and it feels scared, or you perceive it to feel like it has some kind of sense of what's happening because of what will happen to it in the future that may cause it suffering. However, it couldn't, like, if you're kind of sat there on the sofa with it sitting on your lap and it's purring, you're saying, oh, we're going to the vet next week, it can't potentially theorize this idea of at some point in the future this thing will happen. And you use that distinction, which I'm not sure I entirely agree with.
I thought that was more just a representation that, like, language to us means something, and that, like, that's a different form or representation.
Yeah.
But it's more about, it's like a hypothetical prospect in the future.
As in, like,
yeah, I agree with that. Definitely, cats and dogs, they can't form. So they live in the present. They can't think sort of in the past. Well, they sort of think in the past. They have some forms of memory, but they definitely can't project into the future. So yeah, I agree with that. I'm not sure. Yeah, how much that's like
so
conscious. I think
perhaps we can make some distinctions. So I was just going to say that we can maybe distinguish consciousness from self-consciousness, because it seems like Rob was putting them together. I don't think we need to. I think we can say that consciousness is just this pure ability to experience. It's the ability to experience. So whatever kind of experience you have, whether it's a experience of language or just the most basic feeling of pain, that all requires consciousness. But then self-consciousness is this ability to represent the world in language, perhaps, to know who you are and know what the world is and be able to say so. And
then
that's
it isn't the consciousness that counts. It's the degree to which you are conscious. It is the magnitude or the complexity of that consciousness that actually counts. Because if everything, if we can't draw a line, then it doesn't actually matter. Or if we can draw a line and the line is everything, then everything is equally valueless apart from the stuff
we can draw a line, right?
Conscious.
Because tables, we don't worry about hitting a table, but we worry about hitting a dog. So we have this sense there is a line somewhere.
But as in everyone's line is clearly different. And my point is what I'm trying to say is it doesn't actually matter where you put the line. What matters is that there's a starting point and there's a finish, perhaps not a finishing point. Perhaps things can be more conscious than humans. But the point is you've got this scale and things are more important the more conscious they are. It doesn't matter where the line is drawn. Really, on that scale, I think everyone agrees that the table isn't conscious, but it doesn't matter whether the line is human or whether the line is fly or whether the line is amoeba.
Fine, yeah. I mean, I think it's perhaps a less interesting discussion because I think, at least from my understanding, there is just this sense of where do we draw the line, and it's not something that we're ever going to get any solid answer to. But at the same time, it's an extremely meaningful question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Max, you don't think, for example, a fly is conscious. But
do you still think crushing a fly is bad, Max?
Yeah, I wouldn't do it. So I don't eat. Well, I'm vegan at the moment, but usually I don't eat red meat, and I do feel. One, I think. Well, I don't because it's better for I don't eat red meat because it's better for the environment, basically. But I also do feel that sort of slightly better about myself that I'm not that this sort of big complex animal has to be killed. But I'm not sure that's because I think the cow's conscious. I think it's sort of the idea that I'm projecting my consciousness onto the cow. I'm seeing the feelings. I'm seeing that I can imagine a cow reacting to pain, to fear, to sort of suffering, and it will show a reaction, but it's not necessarily feeling that. I'm just sort of projecting my own feelings onto that. So that's the way I see it.
Yeah, see, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it is the consciousness that necessarily counts. I think something might not even know that it's feeling, or might not even be a thing that is there to consciously perceive or to feel. But so long as that feeling's felt, then that provides value or direction. Don't really have more to say than that.
Do you not think
I thought of a little thought experiment. So let's say we all built a robot dog, and we designed it so it had sensors on its back. So when you hit its back, it makes like a whelping noise, and its tail goes between its legs, and it runs off. That's basically what happens when you hit a dog.
Yeah,
is that robot conscious?
Well, I think there's a fundamental difference between that robot and a dog, and I really do think a dog is conscious. In the same way that I would tell any of you guys are conscious, because if I slapped any of you guys, you'd wince in pain. The same with a dog. I'd have no reason to think. I have a lot of reason to think that a dog can't use language in the same way, but I have no reason to think that it can't feel pain in the same way. Especially because we're linked by biology and evolution, right? We're all biological kin with all other biological life forms at some level, right? If you go back far enough from the evolutionary tree. So clearly we have some sort of link to it, and at least the beings that experience consciousness are produced by evolution in some way. There's something about living things and the processes of evolution that is linked to consciousness. So I don't see, I think the burden of proof is on the person who thinks the dog is like a robot. Like I have no reason to see that myself.
Well, and a dog has a brain and nervous system, and these things where we said that consciousness may not like preside in the brain, but the brain is necessary for it. And seeing as a dog does have a brain and a nervous system, I would say it's very different to a robot dog. And again, I know Rob loves this point as well, that if you could make a robot dog that was at the same level of consciousness as like an actual dog or a human, then yes, I would say hitting that would be bad. Or
yeah, I agree.
Bit of a dark joke.
Sorry,
but bit of a dark joke. But I mean, I guess it would depend how hard I'm hitting the dog and how much I laugh.
Nice. We can cut that out. It's fine.
I'm not sure about the idea of if there was a dog that's made that's the same level of consciousness as a real dog, as a robot dog, because I feel like there's something in the idea of kind of biological growth and self-organization that feels inherent to like it's linked to consciousness in some way.
No, I think that's true. I think, obviously the only examples we have of consciousness are out of biological systems. So clearly there's something.
What if you could have what if you could have something that's self-organizing but not biological?
Yes. Yeah, you could.
Yeah,
but this will come back to the question. We don't know what sort of systems are necessary for consciousness to arise.
Yeah.
I think it would be a bold assumption to say they're just biological. I'd also think it's not a bold assumption to say that they are also robotic.
Yeah, you could have
have self-organizing electronic systems that then would be conscious. But I think there would have to be this kind of self-organizing thing, and they'd have to be able to learn. And we already have like AIs. Like an algorithm.
There's this really interesting Guardian article. Don't know if you're.
Yeah, no, I don't think I've heard of it.
I might have missed it, but I don't know. This is slightly dark, but is there a line? Like, is it you create an AI with the same consciousness as a dog? Like, does that apply to like a fly or plants? Like, is it you guys making a line anywhere, or is it everything?
Yeah, where does everyone else draw that line?
That's really hard.
See, it's funny that Mikey appears at this point. We've had conversations before where it comes to the point of either everything's conscious or nothing's conscious. I don't know where I sit on that, or if there is an in-between point and the kind of like self-organizing.
I think either answer is too easy, right? Like I think some things are conscious. But explaining that is just so tricky.
I think to me, what matters more is that there are degrees of consciousness rather than whether something is conscious or not. I think that's too easy. That's too simple. That's a good
point. I mean, would you say there is degrees of consciousness? Because I know you're saying like a fly is conscious. Would you say it's the same amount of conscious as a human?
Yeah, I think this is like a definitional point that we're sort of struggling on in a sense. Because I think for me, consciousness is like almost like a yes or no. I've always thought about it in these terms. Perhaps it's not the right way to think about it. But I don't think you can have degrees of consciousness. Because I think consciousness is the capacity to experience.
Yeah.
And you might have really like small diminished experiences that are really like, barely even what we would call experiences. And you might have really rich, intense experiences on the kind of higher human level. But what I'm saying is consciousness is this pure perspective that it's something it's like to be the thing that's conscious. And that's like an on and off, right? For me, there's no degrees to that.
What about something like
in which case?
So something like an electron. It has like inputs, it has things that respond to things, it's kind of a self-organizing system.
I don't think it's conscious in that sense. Though I wouldn't be able to say that really strongly though. Like there's some things I'm quite opinionated on, but I'm not opinionated on that.
Fair enough.
I don't know if it would be anything to be like an electron. What would it be like to be an electron? I don't,
Electric.
You'd be pretty negative all the time.
One thing we could
Oh
say.
no.
Should end it on that.
What then I'd say is that if consciousness is an on-off thing, then it's not just consciousness that matters to me. And there's plenty of other steps on the way that count more or less towards something having value or meaning. And then I think, to be honest, consciousness is one of the prerequisites, I guess, but it's also not necessarily one of the things we discuss about whether, something has more or less moral value.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Did I just?
But it seems like to me the one of the most basic conscious experiences is the experience of suffering. And for me, and I think for like most of us in some way, suffering is really morally important. And in fact, it's like, I think if we push it far enough, it's always the thing that we come back to. A sense of pain and a sense of happiness. So yeah, maybe I would say that even the most basic things that are conscious could also feel pain. And so then it becomes quite important what things aren't conscious.
But surely something could feel but not perceive that it's feeling, and therefore feel pain without being conscious.
See, but that's where I disagree, perhaps just in principle. Like I think,
or maybe
any
I'm
experience of pain implies, any experience of pain implies a perspective, implies an experience, right? An experience can only happen in consciousness. Like a table doesn't experience anything.
What if it's like an objective pain rather than like a subjective one?
I don't think objective pain is a concept.
Kind of.
What would that be? How could that exist?
Like pain.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think you need.
I'm not sure it is either, but I'm just trying, like, as a kind of train of thought.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I don't know if I could disprove that it exists, but I wouldn't sort of have anything to say about it. I don't think it's a meaningful sentence to say pain without consciousness.
Okay, so.
No, you go.
So then consciousness then gets to, like, with me, it just my own. So if we go with that definition of consciousness, then you have, for me, like two prerequisites for a moral kind of understanding, which would be you have to have things that are capable of being conscious, that are capable of being like perceiving stuff. What would it be like to be?
Sure.
And then some degree of good or bad that can be measured, or not measured, but related, compared. And then the degree to which that conscious being is able to experience. So, I mean, it's able to experience, but how complexly, to what magnitude, those are all questions that build from consciousness. Those are relevant questions that we've then been trying to tackle.
Yeah. I'd agree with all of that, I think.
Yeah, I just sort of thought I'd kind of summarize it in my head, and also for Mikey, who's just rejoined the pod.
So I have a question, which actually relates back to what you were talking about right at the start, before we even started recording, in terms of if you've got idealism, how do you rationalize that to be non-nihilistic?
What do you mean by that? So if we're starting with a sort of subjective idealism, how does that lead to nihilism, in your view?
I'm not sure it's particularly my view, but
or Sil, I guess Sil, this is sort of what Sil feels, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, no. I guess this is I often stray down the path of nihilism when I go down this route, I think. And thinking about it now, I feel like I've changed my mind potentially quite a bit over the last few weeks, but we can stray down these paths just to see if it leads to nihilism. So I would say if, for example, everything is dependent on my mind, I think it comes back to the question is if you think people are inherently good, or there is this potential objective truth. And I think, because, for example, I think that, say, as I potentially believe that psychopaths, for example, can draw genuine pleasure from harming people, right? Or like for their own benefit.
I mean, yeah, like people can, whether they're psychopaths or sociopaths or whatever reason.
But
yeah,
say these people exist, right? As I potentially believe they do, then I would say that if those people exist, then it only, for them, it only really matters that there are nothing that they do to the world matters really, apart from their own happiness.
But don't they only exist in your head still?
Yeah, as in from those people's perspectives.
But they don't exist. They're only you.
Yeah.
They're your perception.
Okay.
Because if you're assuming
unless you're a projection of the psychopath.
As in, well, I would be potentially, right. As in, that's what if a psychopath was an idealist, then they would think I was a projection of them. But I think the point is, if I believe everyone is a projection of my own mind, how do I bring meaning to my life?
It's like the question of other minds, I guess. The question of like, how can we know that other people, if there's someone in there, that there's something that is like to be there? Because all we have is these physical actions of people. We don't have direct access.
It's the same question for animals. How do we know other animal minds? We're just better at doing it for humans because humans act and look like us. So the best explanation is that.
And it's like the hardest problem for subjective idealism, in a way. It's like, if you accept subjective idealism, which in a sense is a simpler way of accepting consciousness than physicalism, you run into this massive problem of solipsism and of other minds, right? I mean, I would answer it. I don't know if I could answer it in a very satisfying way, because it's like one of those things. It's like, how can we know that the world didn't start 2 seconds ago? None of us can know that. It's one of these skeptical problems that you can never really like prove. But I might say that the other minds are kind of necessary. That positing other minds are like, it's a necessary condition for like our logic on the most basic level. I don't think we could have a really understandable sense of ourselves, even a sense of objects in the world, if we didn't have a sense of other minds, or if there was another possible perspective on it.
Yeah, I think that's quite foundational to science, really. That's sort of one of the assumptions that science makes, is that other minds exist and that we're able to have some sort of shared reality.
Yeah,
I think that's quite fundamental.
I think that's what we discussed in the first pod, that there is this some sort of shared existence between, and shared subjective like reality between people.
Yeah.
So going back to your point, how does that lead to nihilism?
Now that I'm going through it, I'm not 100% sure how it leads to nihilism.
Well, I think it's because the way that I understood it before is you kind of, because you're not even sure that these other minds exist. Therefore only kind of you exist.
But if just you exist, you still have your own
I still have my own
happiness and unhappiness. So surely there's meaning in that, even if you're alone in the world. It's a bit sad, but there's still some meaning.
But it's maybe morally nihilistic, right? In that if you were the only person who existed, you could try and maximize your own happiness, but it's morally nihilistic, and you have no reason to be moral, other than if it happens to make you happier.
Yeah, it's like playing a computer game. It's like playing GTA, isn't it? You go around running over pedestrians. You're quite happy to do that in GTA because you're pretty sure you're the only person in there.
But it's almost, I guess it's like the situation where utilitarianism and egoism become the same thing. because you're, you know, everyone and you is the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, by maximizing other people's pleasure, you're maximizing your own pleasure. Yeah, again.
Yeah, exactly.
That is true.
Yeah. That's what I call the Oscar Wilde theory of happiness.
Oscar's theory of happiness.
Oh God, you've all disappeared.
Oh no.
What?
All gone.
Mikey,
Okay.
do you think consciousness resides in the brain?
Oh, you missed
All
it.
disappeared. I'm gone.
I don't know. This is like one of the things that I'm really unsure of, is like where conscious. I don't know. I still haven't really figured out what I think about this. I think basically, if consciousness is, there's kind of like two things. It's like, if consciousness is just kind of a word we use to describe things in the physical world, then like, yeah, you know, that's in the brain. But to me, that's not a very interesting concept. You know, it's like, it's kind of like a human classification. But if consciousness is, you know, some like higher thing, some that, you know, maybe exists kind of like outside the universe in some sense, I don't know. It's really hard.
Listen to the pod when it comes out, Mike.
Yeah.
It will be solved.
Okay.
But I also, Rob, you're like.
So did we solve it while I went for a week? Did we work out what's right and wrong?
Yeah, it's all done, mate.
It's done.
It's done.
Yeah.
Oh, you missed it.
Oh, I can't wait. So excited.
Yeah, Rob, this kind of like, from what I've been getting for this last like hour or two, like, it kind of seems that you potentially don't, or like, you can't find a sense of meaning in consciousness as a thing. And would that be accurate?
I can't find a sense of meaning in consciousness as a thing.
Yeah. Or that consciousness matters. Like, you keep saying, why does it matter?
I understand. Basically, I think that consciousness is one of the things you need for meaning, but I don't think it's the. I think you also need other things. For example, you need a positive and a negative. Meaning almost intrinsically has that, right?
But I do think this like good and bad, as I think Aamir said as well, just like arises from consciousness, and like I don't see a way past the idea that like everything does arrive from consciousness. You can't.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, but then it still has to actually arise from consciousness.
Yeah.
As in, you can have consciousness without a good and a bad. Feasibly,
though I think perhaps in practice it doesn't really. That's not really the case.
Yeah, because
connecting it to biology as well, and all biological organisms have a sense of survival. And
yeah, no, I think that there probably is a good and a bad.
Is that innate consciousness, or just how it's always happened to arise from biology?
I don't think it's innate. Yeah, perhaps the Buddha would be an example of someone who has consciousness, but doesn't have that sense of good and bad, because the Buddha, by definition, at least if you believe the Buddhists, can't suffer.
So yeah, this is an interesting thing that I didn't really get with the suffering one, because if it's a fundamental property, it's like it's reverse utilitarianism, but it's like quite stark reverse utilitarianism, in that he thinks that kind of we have our base state means that we are net unhappy.
Yeah. This
which
is
I fundamentally disagree with. I mean, I don't know. I've thoroughly enjoyed my life so far. And there have been bad bits. There have been suffering, sure, but like it's been pretty good. I quite like to keep going as I am, or better. But you know, certainly you wouldn't want to get rid of the emotion part.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure how the Buddha would answer it. Really, I can't think right now. But it's the problem that a lot of people have with Buddhism, is that I have quite strongly. In fact, I had a tutorial on Friday with my tutor, and it like shocked me because I was it was a tutorial on Buddhism. He was saying that there's like some Buddhist schools that believe that when the Buddha was enlightened, it wasn't that he saw the kind of blissful truth of the universe and that like everything sort of made sense. His consciousness just stopped. Like there was no experience after that. After that point of enlightenment, like that's it. It was just a blank. It was basically what we think of as death. But the thing is the Buddhists believe that that you're stuck. You're constantly living because you're constantly being reincarnated, and so that experience is always suffering. And so the goal is to get out of it. And so that these Buddhists believe that when the Buddha was enlightened, that's it. That it was the end. And his body kind of kept moving, but there was nothing going on. And that's insane. I mean, I don't like that at all. But it's a problem because there's evidence in some of what the Buddha says and in some Buddhist schools to kind of take that view.
I mean, if you believe that, is it the logical conclusion if just to like kill everything? And like, so, because can you be reincarnated?
That doesn't work, does it?
You can't in the Buddhist world. If you kill everything,
kill everything.
No, it's genius, Mikey. That's incredible. I love it.
No, I don't.
No, but I mean, okay, but let's say you kill
everything's dead. Yeah.
No, but it doesn't work.
There's other worlds, there's realms, and there's different planes of existence in Buddhism.
So
if you kill everything on the earth, they'll just reincarnate on a different planet somewhere.
And
you thought of that one.
You want to maximize the probability of reaching this enlightened state.
What if every time you're reincarnated, you destroy the entire world? Eventually, you're going to get through them all, right?
Okay, what about this? Everyone simultaneously kills themselves.
These ancient Buddhist debates.
Yeah, they've had a few thousand years to think about this, haven't they? So I'm sure they covered all the bases.
Yeah.
I didn't think of this.
Yeah.
We do it as a diss topic or something.
No, speaking of like covering bases though, there's an interesting thing I listened to. It was about the Mongols and the way they approach morality, Genghis Khan and his lot. Because I mean, obviously they must have had pretty warped morality given they literally went round erasing civilizations and being the single largest human cause of human death.
Yeah, killed like 10% of the population or something.
Yeah. And their basic logic was they didn't not believe in any, they believed in all religions because they wanted each one to have a celestial insurance policy because they thought, well, they're all equally likely to be right. So we want to make sure that whichever one is right, we've had their backs. So they just went and sort of tried to subscribe to every single morality and do them all kind of equally badly and equally well. And that way, whichever one turned out to be true, they wouldn't be the best at it, but they also would be far from the worst and they'd be okay. Which I think is an interesting way of looking at the whole thing. It's just kind of going, okay, well, I'm not going to make my own mind up, but one of you's probably right, so I'll try and do it all.
Edgy bets.
Lovely.
Does that come off? Does that work, or do we think that's batty?
What about when a religion says there is only one God and believing in other gods is like completely against this religion?
Then they turn.
I think most of them say that, sadly,
and a lot of them say that.
Yeah. Those are the ones that didn't keep existing when they came into contact with the Mongols very, very often.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the Mongols.
Your God ceases. Sorry.
Yeah, the Mongols didn't really last very long, though, right? They split up into loads of different Khanates, and some of them became Islamic, some became Buddhist. So they didn't really last very long.
It was a 2-generation thing. Basically, it was Genghis Khan kind of united them, conquered a vast majority of the steppe and China and the rest, and then he kind of managed to somehow get his sons. This is what was kind of unique about them, was it was 2 generations, whereas Alexander the Great and Napoleon and like all the other kind of great conquerors, if you want to call them great, mass murdering kind of pillaging twats throughout history, kind of who tried to pass on their legacy, often failed, whereas he managed to get his sons, of which there were plenty, famously vast amounts, to all kind of agree on not even the oldest one, but one of the ones who was slightly younger being the next kind of great Khan. And then they continued on, which is why they basically managed to conquer so much, because they had a vast vastly superior army and lasted in that kind of hyper unstable form longer than pretty much anything else. But yeah, after that they sort of split. You had Kublai in China and all the other ones in everywhere else. But yeah, Kublai is the interesting one that most people think.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, the kind of question of religious pluralism and of like how, because, you know, we in the modern West can be non-religious, but we have to sort of realize that that's a really particular view. And most people throughout history have been religious. And, you know, religion is defined in all sorts of senses, but they've all kind of had this perspective of consciousness being somehow fundamental in reality and having this big kind of cosmic view of the world. And religious,
right?
Sorry?
Did hunter-gatherers feel that? Do apes feel that? Like, at what point? I'm interested. I mean, there's no real known answer, but like, how far does it go back until
the first evidence we have, right, of hunter-gatherers? Like the first kind of evidence we have of their culture is somewhat religious, in that they, well, whether that's religious or not is somehow like hard to tell. But I think some of the first cave paintings that we have are like half human, half animal. And so there's clearly some sort of sense of these beings that don't really exist.
But is that because religion's what spurred them to do that? Or is it because they were religious well before that happened? Or is it like religion was the thing that gave them culture?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting
question. It's like, we don't know how far religion predates that, because it could be that 100 years before the cave paintings, there was no spiritualism or religion or belief in consciousness at all. We just know it goes back that far.
Yeah, I guess so. But I don't think we have any evidence to like assume that. I think sort of if we're looking at likelihood, it seems that like as soon as people could develop language and a sense of culture, that they had a kind of cosmic view of the world. Maybe. I don't know enough to make that claim.
Isn't there a theory that religion is one of the things that allowed Homo sapiens to kind of like beat the other types of humans by like allowing us to like build larger groups, because we were like held together by I think they call it like myths. So things like the idea of a religion, like something larger than yourself.
Yeah.
So
yeah, like what's his name? Like Yuval Noah Harari's books, *Sapiens*.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might be where I read it. Actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is why I don't know if good or bad is a thing. You know how, like, in our architecture education, they talk about sort of civilizations being formed to sort of increase productivity or increase sort of an ease of living. That if everything is just sort of built around us coming together for a means of survival, then can you not just look at good and bad as like something that is necessary to keep us alive and functioning? Like, can you even then reduce it to good and bad, or can you just see it as like a thing that was necessary to happen? Does that make sense? Like, it's,
well, maybe it came about that way through evolution, through processes of natural selection where like the promulgation of your species and your individual genome is important. But maybe it's not limited by that. Maybe that's just what kind of allowed morality to happen. But maybe morality isn't explained fully. It doesn't exhaust the phenomenon of morality to explain it through biology. And there's some theologians who argue, I think perhaps quite cogently, that with the laws of physics being as they are, and the world existing, the world originating in the way that it did, that the evolution of like bipedal intelligent life is kind of almost necessary, like it's coded into the fabric of the universe, because of just, you know, as what we're saying, the evolution isn't some sort of special thing that happens on Earth. It's just the process of things surviving. And so as the universe develops and as certain planets develop and out of all of the planets, there'll be certain conditions. And some of those conditions will give birth to life, and the progression of that evolutionary process will eventually lead, I mean, some theologians argue, to bipedal intelligent life. So there's an argument, I think, to be made in some way that intelligence and intelligence developing through evolution is somehow kind of coded into the universe. So perhaps we got here through evolution, but perhaps we're not just an accident. Maybe there's something quite like important in universal terms of why we're here, and maybe our morality is part of that.
Well, like we're a loading program for AI. That could be quite important.
Oh yeah, there's people who say that too. Yeah, that we're the caterpillar for the butterfly of AI.
Yeah.
I hope not.
Well, also, why bipedal out of interest?
I don't know. Yeah, that's interesting.
Why bipedal, did you say?
Yeah, why bipedal?
I mean, there's very strong evolutionary reasons for why we're bipedal, and why that's led to intelligence.
What is bipedal, sorry?
Walks on two legs rather than four.
Oh, okay.
I mean, rather than any other number, but typically
it frees up your hands so you can create stuff and do stuff, right?
It's because your head is balanced on the spine rather than being held up by vast muscles, which require you to have a much stronger skull in early formation. So your skull has much longer to be soft and develop and allow your brain to develop. So our brains can develop for a much longer period of time than quadrupeds.
And that's really fascinating because, well, I was just going to say that in India, there's this idea of the spine, of like the extension of the spine being in some way linked to kind of consciousness and being in connection to the universe.
In terms of, like,
so maybe there's something about the straight spine is like coming through evolution and allowing intelligence.
Wow.
I don't know, just a thought.
That is very cool.
So just touching on what you were saying before about like kind of humans being, or the evolution of intelligent bipedal beings kind of like being inherent in the universe. So kind of the question is, okay, so if that is somehow fixed in the universe, so do you think has this happened on other planets, would you say?
I don't know. I mean, my hunch is to say yes, but I think that's just it's kind of like a fun side question. I don't know. I have like a cousin who's really into conspiracy theories, and he's like sure that aliens have had a big part in human history.
Oh, really?
But who knows? A cousin of mine, so I kind of get that a lot.
Nice.
But yeah.
I think is it called the Fermi paradox?
Yeah, I was just about to say that.
Yeah, it's weird that we've not discovered other forms of intelligent life in anywhere else.
Discovered by that we know of,
Yeah, and there's numerous reasons why that might be. One being, one could be there's no other intelligent life. Two, I can't remember. There's lots of reasons. Two, it could be that there's a reason everyone's silent. There's something out there that is inherently dangerous.
I've not had that one before.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of them as well is that a civilization. This is straying more into politics now and stuff, I think, but it's that a civilization can't reach like the barrier of interstellar travel before collapsing politically, and like that you can't do that. You can't you can't pour the resources into interstellar travel without first collapsing politically because you've not prioritized the right things for society.
The one I heard most recently that was most compelling to me was that we're just not interesting enough to be worth discovering. There's plenty of planets.
We could still discover them.
Yeah, I know, but we the stars are out there and they're very big and there's lots of them and we just haven't come across them yet. But these other civilizations that are ahead of us have found loads of other planets and systems with other organisms on, and we're just they saw us and like, well, you're really boring. There's not much going on, and we're going to look at the ones that are more interesting, and so they didn't bother interfering because there's just so many that we aren't worth it. I thought that was quite a compelling one. That we're just so.
I find that so.
You find that one?
I mean, yeah. I think I agree. Surely one of them would have found us. But what if, the universe isn't? It's old, but it's not that old. What if the super kind of advanced ones, there aren't that many of them, and they've?
I mean, and if you think about the advances humans have made in 100 years, and then you think the universe is billions of years old.
Yeah, what if they've already found everything and we're just really not interesting? What if they see us and they're just not interested at all? And there's always that option as well. They don't even bother looking.
Yeah, maybe they actively don't want to.
Yeah.
Well, so we've slowed down massively in progression, right? As in, you say how far we come in 100 years, but is it not slowing down? Is Moore's law not like stopping and like?
Well,
Moore's law is stopping with computers, but that's. Yeah, I mean, they're finding other ways to.
We are working in a field still where we want to be growing bits of animal tissue. Like, how long before we're able to grow brains and meddle with those? And, that starts accelerating the pace. There's loads of other bits of progress that aren't just AIs and computers.
This is an interesting question I'd like to ask if I can, because I talk to humanities people more than I talk to science people, and I think their perspective on this question is different. But it's been kind of mentioned offhand, but the idea of passing on intelligence, passing the torch of intelligence to AI, say, and maybe AI destroying the world and it kind of flourishing and being the next stage of evolution, maybe. Do you guys see that as a positive thing or as a negative thing?
It depends on the AIs. But I mean,
okay, could it be a positive thing?
Yeah,
it could. I think it could definitely be a positive thing. I don't know. My perspective is very negative. I think it will always certainly be a bad thing. I just can't see it. I just can't see humans ever being able to specify what we want to an AI. That's just so hard. And if you get it slightly wrong,
why does it matter what we like? Here's the thing that I often use, that I've had lots of people say they don't necessarily agree with me on, is if the AI is, we've already kind of established things, consciousness is perhaps an on-off thing, but in the way we were saying more conscious, or it's it's able to feel more, think more, is more complex than we are, is a better thinking, feeling machine, if you want to phrase it in those terms, than a human being, then surely what the AI should want to optimize or maximize the utility of most, the things they should prioritize most, are themselves rather than humans, and that would be good. That would be intrinsically good, and therefore whether they are doing what's right for us or not is actually besides the point. It's whether they're doing what's right overall.
So you're saying they matter more than humans because they're more smart?
I'm saying they could. I'm not saying they necessarily do, because obviously I don't know what the AIs are going to be like and which ones are going to come first, and there's a million different caveats. But if we're talking about a possible situation where they can be good but even be bad for humans, I think that's possible.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of
quantity, right? It's not about how much feeling they have, how much intelligence they have, but the quality of how they use it.
Thing, and I mean the same thing, surely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, I guess, but yeah, okay, interesting. I have lots of thoughts.
I'm not sure, can we achieve that? I think it goes back to the sort of fundamental questions I was asking about consciousness and where does consciousness arise from? If we can never know that, or it's going to take so long to approach that, how are we going to create some sort of artificial general intelligence? Unless we're just talking about complex automation, or there might not be a difference. So.
Okay, now here's another interesting one. This is the one I often think about because it scares me more, given it's the field I work in. Is what if we create brains that are more complex and more capable than we are? What if
you can do that anyway, Rob. That was you can watch some sex education, and you can. That's how that works.
But I mean, in a much more accelerated way, in a way that isn't necessarily human.
Growing brains, yeah.
What if you grow a biological system that is more intelligent, more capable of feeling than we are, and it is biological? How do you respond?
You'd think that would matter more than humans then.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I agree with this, because I think, again, I'm not sure that like I would be any more important than a dog or like a cat.
Yeah.
Like, this is why I don't think I like inherently agree with it, because I'm not sure my consciousness is worth anything more than another person's consciousness. So yeah.
That's another person's. Would you say your consciousness is worth more than an ant's?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, like let's say there's a person, there's like we know there's individual differences in how people think and feel. Let's say there's someone who sort of feels emotions more than another person.
But you would still, like, you would destroy an anthill rather than die.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you probably think that the anthill is worth less than you, despite the fact there's a lot of
than me, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So your consciousness, therefore, is worth more.
I wouldn't say that's because I think my consciousness is worth more.
Strong. Elaborate, please, though.
Well, I guess this is it's really hard to explain. It arises more out of feelings than any rational thought, potentially. But I wouldn't say, for example, that a more emotional person or someone who is more capable of emotions than me potentially would be worth more or better for this universe than me. I don't see that as irrational.
Yeah, that's true. You know,
I understand.
Like when there's like severely disabled people and things, we still value them as humans, and we don't say that they're not worth that much. So there's a kind of sense though you get to a certain level maybe, and that once maybe it's not about degree all the way. Maybe with like animals, you could say maybe going back in evolutionary terms, it's about degree. But once there's a kind of level of self-consciousness, because we all seem to agree that there's something unique about humans rather than animals, and that they can use language and that they're self-conscious. So maybe once we do all
agree. I'm not sure
there is a kind of basic inviolable sense in which they can't be violated. So even if there was a really intelligent alien, I don't think I'd feel that intelligent alien is any more valuable than Sil. Even if it was way more intelligent. And I think self-consciousness.
It's an interesting point, because I'm not sure how I feel about the whole. Like, there's a lot of. If you look at the difference between chimpanzee and human development, and you see, at least I think this is correct. I haven't done, vast amounts. I've done a decent amount, but not like loads of reading on this. That young chimps up until about, I think, age 2 are more, or appear to be much more conscious and kind of intelligent than young humans. And obviously, the human is going to become a human of adults, and the chimp is only going to become a chimp adult, if you want to give those two distinctions. But at the time, I would say you almost should probably treat the chimp with more care and more, worth. Yeah, I'm not sure I buy this whole humans have an intrinsic worth.
Should you not consider the future potential?
That's obviously a consideration. But it's for example, like, say you've got someone who's been, like, for whatever reason they've had like a brain trauma that's put them into like a vegetative state. I really don't think they're worth that much, which is a dark thing to say, and like I know it's quite controversial, but I honestly I'm not sure just because they're human that carries. Like it's the characteristics of your intelligence. Like if I was put into a vegetative state, I would really hope the world doesn't waste resources on keeping me alive.
But then when they're vegetative, they wouldn't be self-conscious. So if we're saying that self-consciousness is what makes them...
I was sort of saying vegetative to get myself out of needing to go into the dark area of like different degrees of mental disabilities and things like that, and which ones you talk about. But yeah, I was going full goo there, but my point is I think there are degrees, and therefore if you have, debilitating mental cognitive disorders that kind of impact how intelligent or emotionally capable you are, for example, things like psychopathy and sociopathy, I think they do impact or they could very well impact your worth, if you want to call it that.
Rob, as a utilitarian, right, as in you're saying you want to maximize happiness.
Yeah.
Do you not think, for example, someone who's mentally limited in some way has the potential to be as happy, if not more happy than you?
I think more happy is very credible. I think you look at Down syndrome, people with Down syndrome are frequently more happy than people without.
So exactly, like why is that any worth any less?
But there's two facets to that, right? To someone's, so you've got how happy they're capable of being, and how happy they're capable of making other people feel.
Right.
And if someone's, like for example, Robin Williams was clearly not a very happy person, but made millions of people happy around the world through his performances. So I would say he's worth a lot, despite the fact that he himself was very down so much that he, sadly committed suicide.
Right.
And so I think that there's more to consider, but yeah, the point is, but both do come into account. And if being, if you're in a state where you are considerably less capable of feeling happiness and you're making bad decisions in terms of decisions that are going to make other people feel extremely unhappy, then yeah, you're probably not worth as much as someone who is, deeply compassionate and making deeply compassionate sort of decisions and has an amazing depth of feeling. And that's my opinion. And I think that's, perhaps one that isn't necessarily shared by society at the moment.
So do you think that if there's someone who's, say, kind of quite, maybe a little bit morally reprehensible, isn't really giving much good to the rest of the world, and isn't even themselves very happy, do you think it would be morally okay to kill that person? To put it in really stark terms.
If you follow utilitarianism, like, to the letter, yes.
I mean,
that's the case.
There are grey areas, and I don't know who's doing the killing, and I don't know in what context. But like, do you think it's morally okay to kill Hitler? I think it probably is. He was a very reprehensible person who clearly, a large portion of his life wasn't very happy. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know where you draw the line, and I've already been quite careful.
The difference between like active negative effect and no positive effect. So if someone was just having a neutral effect.
So someone was just like, then I would probably say no. I'd probably try and have I'd probably say that the better move would be to try and like make them have a positive effect through discussion and regulation and kind of cultural influence. But yeah, at some point someone has enough of a negative effect and is negative themselves that you start thinking we're all better off without them.
Well, I have a problem. I have quite a few problems with all of this. I think is that
I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, well, no, but firstly, seeing as we can't really measure happiness anyway, right? We have no discernible way of measuring happiness. How is it for you to say that this person is A, causing less happiness in the world, or B, themselves less happy? I don't think you can say that, seeing as we can't measure it.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's impossible to say which people are like worth less, or if you're worth less, or if anything's worth less. And therefore, also, even with this supposedly AI, which is more capable of emotions and feelings and whatever, you can't say it has the capability for more happiness.
Well, you can say, you just can't be sure of it.
Sorry?
You can think it and not know it. And sometimes if everyone thinks it enough...
That doesn't make it true, I think.
No, but nothing, we don't know if anything's true. That's sort of been the whole point of the last three. So just because we don't know it's true doesn't mean we don't have to take action on it.
I think it's very troublesome to take action on something you might believe is true, and especially with something as
incomprehensible. Then I can't take action on anything, Sil, because I think everything might be true.
There are some things you can be more sure of than other things.
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah, but I think happiness I can be pretty damn sure of.
Really? I thought this whole discussion was that we're not sure what happiness is at all.
We're not sure, but like I think I can be in myself and in others relatively sure of it. I know.
I think the thing about human subjectivity is that we can be really wrong about it a lot of the time.
I agree.
Like a concrete example, I was really high with my mates last night, and I was having the best time ever. And one of my mates was saying he's having the worst time ever, and I thought he was really having a good time.
Yeah.
And so you can just be like really, really wrong.
I think if we showed you two people, Rob, you might have and one of them was sad and one of them was happy. There was a high potential you wouldn't be able to tell at all.
Over a very relatively short period of time with a small sample size. But if you take what for example, what Hitler did in World War II, I think you've got enough of a large sample size over a long enough period of time. You can probably say what he did caused net unhappiness.
So
I get there's grey area, and with grey area you have to be extremely careful. But I think eventually you can probably say someone did a bad thing if they did it enough for a long enough time to a large enough degree.
Well, I would then.
I also think generally, like you're able to have some sort of like way of thinking about how other people feel and how you feel. It's not all completely sort of relative. Like we have some idea of what makes people happy and what makes people sad. Like not what exactly it is and what and like sometimes it can be wrong, but I think on the whole, like yeah, I know Rob at the moment is fairly happy because the way he talks about what he's up to. So yeah, stuff
I
like
have
that.
this really fun thing I do every Sunday with some cool dudes where we chat about stuff and then we post it online and no one listens.
Yeah, that as well.
Have you guys, has anyone read Crime and Punishment? Dostoevsky's book?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
A while ago.
I mean, a lot of this kind of reminds me a little bit of like Raskolnikov, and he's the character in Crime and Punishment, and he's this kind of like intellectual character. He's kind of somewhat likable, and he's I don't really remember exactly, but he's kind of like midway between like a Nietzschean and like he feels like he can just sort of assert his own morality on his own terms, and he's a bit of a utilitarian as well. And there's this other character who's like she's like really quite morally reprehensible. She's like really like abusing this other person. So Raskolnikov kind of figures that I could just kill her and take her money, and like I will actually be doing a good for the world. It won't like why should that be morally reprehensible? He's sort of trying to assert morality on his own terms, and he does it. And the moment he does it, he has this massive breakdown because he like thought the whole time that he could have all of these moral ideas, that he could sort of assert morality, in his own way without sort of relying on a bigger structure. But it was in that moment he had this kind of big breakdown and sort of realized he wasn't as amoral as he thought. And I think like Dostoevsky's point is that utilitarianism, a lot of this kind of abstract moral thinking is great when we're in a philosophy seminar and we can kind of abstract all of these things. But there's a way in which our morality is deeper even than we think. And there's kind of some things that we're moral about whether we like it or not. It's like very deeply ingrained. And so like, and I think like it's part of Dostoevsky's border project to sort of say that that we kind of have to believe in some sort of moral principle, whether we like it or not, because it's the thing that makes sense of everything else that we do.
Can it not just be utilitarianism with an enormous amount of personal uncertainty? So like you generally abide by it, but you kind of need like a lot of, to make these big actions, you need like a lot of kind of confirmation.
Yeah, I mean, you could read Dostoevsky in just saying that, well, that morality is just very deeply socially ingrained. But I think he's trying to make a slightly different point.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of thinking as I'm speaking. So.
We all are.
Robert, we should have. I think we should have a more heated discussion about measuring happiness at some point. But I don't think it's very apt for this.
Well, I'm doing a course on happiness this term, so come back to me in about 10 weeks, and I will have some good points.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think if we want to do a follow up to this one, we should do it after we've let some listeners digest it, and we've had a chance to digest it, and like come back to this maybe not next week, but in a month or two's time, and we can pepper the next few weeks with, you know, rhinos versus hippos and
That's always the example you bring up.
Gandalf beating Dumbledore very easily, and you know, other elementary and amusing questions.
I would love a ins and outs of Buddhism, if possible.
Was it like right now or a separate podcast?
Oh,
Definitely not right now. But
Yeah.
Wow.
We can scour guests and see who wants to come on and speak about what.
I also really want to have one on like veganism and vegetarianism because
oh, that would be cool. Yeah.
We were listening to a podcast today as well, which
It was the Sean Carroll one,
which was interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'd be really interested in doing veganism.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. I feel like having a big talk about it will actually convince me to do it.
Well, see, yeah, I think veganism is an interesting one to do, but I always flip about whether I think it's worth it or not.
Mate, you're a massive sociopath.
Yeah, I probably am.
That was a
Yeah.
joke, by the way, because of something said to Robert some point.
Yeah, but towards certain animals, they're probably right, though. It's the thing. Is the sad thing. No,
Well,
I think there's more grey area than some vegans make out. But I think, like there is just a really strong moral claim. I think like the kind of naive point that, I just do it because it tastes good, or humans are better, or these kind of basic arguments don't really work. But I think there are some kind of...
Well, yeah, except if you are, if you are an egoist or...
Well, I don't think anyone's an egoist.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think I've ever met or even heard of someone who's an egoist.
Well, I think you can be an egoist but still value what other people think, because making other people happy makes you happy.
No, but who was that? Watched a really interesting TED talk on it the other day about this American. I don't. He's not that. Him being American is kind of circumstantial, but he was a.
Some American.
Well, I don't know, man. American.
It's narrowed it down to about 370 million people, hasn't it?
But yeah, funny enough, he was a capitalist kind of management consultant who kind of was famous for going around kind of terminating 30% of the workforce. He was famous for having like a good sense of humor, where someone would be like, "Oh, I just bought myself a new car," and he'd be walking around the company and be like, "Oh, it's nice you've got a new car, but you know what you don't have? A job," and then fire them. It was a TED talk on psychopathy, and the guy was a psychologist, and he went to this kind of capitalist management consultant's house, and basically asked him about his life. And it wouldn't surprise me, given the kind of the traits he described, if this guy was an egoist.
Maybe psychopaths could be egoists. But that's like a very, very small percentage and like a unique kind of pathology.
But it's also, it's like a logically valid moral philosophy.
It's not logically valid, but I don't think it's humanly possible. I think that's different.
Well, it is with psychopaths.
It is with psychopaths, yeah.
I mean, did you read the chapter on psychopaths in Charles Eisenstein's?
Yeah. I don't really remember what he said. Do you remember what he said?
Yeah, so he basically had this chapter on psychopaths saying it's an oft-cited argument against intrinsic good, or it's often brought up. And he made a few points. One of them was that psychopathy isn't something that's necessarily like you are born a psychopath and you are a psychopath for the rest of your life. It's not something that's kind of static. It can change. People can develop it. People can grow out of it. And he gives a few examples of that. He also says potentially psychopathy isn't just, it isn't just this like inherently bad thing that's like evil. He actually made the idea that if you look at, say, someone who claims to be almost enlightened, is that not a form of psychopathy? Because you're kind of devoid of empathy. Like, could it actually be quite good for some ways of looking at it? And I can't remember what other points he made.
Well, I think his core point as well was that because I was reading all that, and I was like, yeah, fine, but they can still exist. However, he then, I think, does eventually go on to say he basically believes that psychopaths do actually still have the capability to be good and to care. And so I think he basically says he doesn't think psychopaths exist, which I think you can believe. Like, that's fair enough. You can, yeah.
I've heard that like loving kindness meditation, which is like a particular form of Buddhist meditation, is like one thing that has been like there's shown evidence that can actually help psychopaths feel empathy.
Yeah.
So maybe there's possibilities.
Yeah, and if there's no possibility that psychopaths can change and have the capability for good, then I think your argument holds valid that egoism isn't a thing. Isn't humanly possible.
I mean, one of the big reason I'd say egoism isn't a thing, I think, because even like the most selfish person, like, you know, they treat their daughter without being selfish. They treat their family, you know. So we all have a bubble of people in which that we would be absolutely selfless with. I think the question of morality is about expanding that bubble. I don't think for any human being, it's really just the bubble includes only themselves. I think there are people with varying degrees of kind of selflessness and empathy that you have towards them, but it's always just about expanding that. Often people treat other people better than they treat themselves. I think that's probably true of so many.
I'm not sure about this absolute selflessness which people have with their bubble. I would say my bubble for selflessness includes myself and no one else. But
I don't know, man. I doubt it.
But for complete selflessness, like, I don't think we've had this discussion with, I believe, Rob and Max, where I don't think there's a single person, even Emma, who I would give my life for to save their life.
Get out of there quick.
a lot of people would, though. Like mothers would sacrifice themselves.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that there are people who would. I'm saying I think
instinct.
It's also quite an abstract discussion, you know. Like maybe when it came to it, you'd feel differently.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell.
It's true, yeah.
But like it's almost like my guess is as good as yours in this, right? I don't think we know ourselves absolutely, and so, you know, just because you say that, I'm not going to sort of believe that it's true.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know if it's true, but I'm just, yeah. Sorry, Mikey, what were you saying?
So this is kind of like a side point, but so talking about how egoists don't necessarily exist, I was going to say you could view it in a way that essentially everyone is an egoist, because even if you're a utilitarianist or, you know, any morality, you're doing, as in following that morality feels good for you. You know, like helping other people feels good. So could you not just say you're just doing what makes you feel good, and that just happens to be, you know, following some other morality? So is not everyone an egoist?
Yeah, I think the evidence from the evidence from sort of behavioral science and psychology is that it's like clear that altruism, like pure altruism, is a thing. Like a lot of what looks like altruism is just people, like you say, acting in a way that makes them feel good or sort of protects them in the future.
So I've mentioned this book before, but there's a book I've been reading called Against Empathy: The Case for Rational Compassion, which I'd recommend. And it's kind of on this point of like, you might not be altruistic, but you can convince yourself that things that would previously you might have seen as, you know, purely altruistic, like negative to yourself and beneficial to others, are beneficial enough to others that you can enjoy doing them and therefore are beneficial to you, sort of thing. Like, if you can convince yourself that, like, where do you draw the line with what's altruistic? Because if you know it's going to be negative to you, but it's going to benefit others, and therefore you suddenly now enjoy that, does that then rule that out from being altruism?
And with that thought, we will leave you there. While we may have ended up giving you more questions to ask than answers, we hope you have enjoyed our conversation around morality and related topics today. If you haven't already, we would recommend the previous 2 podcasts on science for more similar content. We would like to thank our guests, Max and Mikey, for joining us again, and also Aamir for being here today to contribute a different opinion to the conversation. As always, get in touch if you have any questions or suggestions yourself, and thanks again for listening. That's it from us at Comprehensive Nonsense.